Halloween is the one night a year when it's completely ordinary to see monsters mingling with the crowd. It's the time for everyone to don costumes and masks, stepping into a world of make-believe. But what if someone truly sinister were lurking behind one of those disguises, using Halloween's shadowy allure to bring a nightmare to life? This is precisely what happened to 21-year-old Nikki Hutchings. Let me introduce you to Nicole Marie Hutchings and her story. Nicole, who was called Nikki by her family and friends, was born in San Francisco, California, on June 15, 1983, to her mom Robin, who met Nicole's stepfather James Hutchings, who went by Jim when Nicole was only 1. At 2 years old, Jim was the only father that Nikki ever knew, and he considered her his daughter, raising her like she was. So I'm going to refer to Jim as Nikki's father, like she did. Over the coming years, 2 more children joined the Hutchings family. Nikki got a little sister, Amanda, in January of 1987, and her little brother Timothy in July of 1992. After Jim got out of the Marine Corps in 1987, he and Robin decided they wanted to raise their family in a quieter, smaller town, and they fell in love with Bend, Oregon. It had such a peaceful atmosphere, and it was one of the first places that Jim and Robin took Nikki for vacation, where she saw snow for the very first time. It was a very memorable experience. She absolutely loved it. They played in the snow together, built a snowman, and with all the fond memories, the family picked up and moved from California to Bend, which isn't exactly a small town per se, but is said to be either a small city or a big town with a small town feel. It's nestled in the heart of the Cascade Mountains. Bend, Oregon, is a city with a split personality, so to speak. On one hand, it's a laid-back outdoor paradise with world-class skiing, mountain biking, and hiking. But on the other hand, it's a thriving, bustling, creative community with a vibrant art scene, a growing craft beer industry, and diverse culinary locations. This duality is reflected in the city's landscape as well. In downtown, you'll find charming brick buildings and tree-lined streets, but if you venture a little further out, you'll find yourself surrounded by towering pines and jagged mountain peaks. So it really is the best of both worlds, and a very nice place to raise kids. In 1987, the town had about 60,000 residents. It was definitely populated back then. Now it's Central Oregon's most populated city. The Hutchings moved to a more rural area. They got a 3-bedroom, 2-bath, 1,300 square feet home along the Deschutes River. The river was in their backyard, so they could go fishing right outside, just steps away from their door. That's something that Nikki had been doing since she was only 2 years old. Once in Bend, they enjoyed taking little Nikki to Drake Park, which is gorgeous. It's one of the city's most popular parks. A lot of people from the community frequent the area, surrounded by ponderosa pines, and it's close to a bunch of downtown shops. This park has many events throughout the year, like music events and movies. It's a great place for a little nature walk, and it's actually the place that Nikki gave her grandpa his nickname, Grandpa Duck. The first time he took her there, they saw a bunch of ducks. She could hardly talk at the time, but she managed to say, "Grandpa Duck, Grandpa Duck." It's funny what kind of things stick like that. Drake Park would also remain one of Nikki's favorite places to spend time as she got older. The Hutchings' new home, like I told you, had the perfect view of this river from their kitchen and living room windows. They settled in right before Nikki turned 4, and her little sister Amanda was born. As soon as she became a big sister, Robin said that Nikki was like a little mom. She was so cute. She would sit there and feed her little sister. She even helped her change her diapers and would always ask her mom to take little Amanda out of her crib to play. Nikki also loved learning. Her mom said she actually begged to go to school before she was ready, and she did really well throughout her elementary years. Jim called Nikki a math whiz, but she also loved learning things from her mom, who was a very proud homemaker. She liked to go camping, do craft projects, write poetry, and of course, spend time with her family. Nikki learned to cook and sew. She even helped sew buttons back on Jim's military uniforms. However, she had a daring side as well. Not that you can't if you like doing those things, but Nikki liked being one of the boys, so to speak. She started shooting rifles when she was only 7 years old with her dad, and she also became best buddies with her little brother, who was born 5 years after they settled into Bend, completing the Hutchings family. Another thing Nikki loved to do was actually have silly string fights. She and her friends from school would come over and have full-on silly string shootouts. At first, Jim took a job as a long-haul trucker, but he found it hard to balance his work and personal life. His children were his main priority, and he hated being away from them for so long. Due to the nature of his job, he would spend days, if not weeks, on the road, making it hard for him to be present for all of his children's important memories. Despite his job's financial benefits, Jim ultimately left the trucking industry to spend more time with his family. There was so much to do in Bend, and whether Nikki was by the water or amongst the trees, she seemed to operate on a different level. Being in nature as she grew up put her completely at peace. Those who knew her said she had a magnetic energy when she was outdoors. It was almost like this radiant joy that came over her, and you could almost feel it when you were around her. She absolutely knew she wanted to be around animals as much as she could, and from a young age, she wanted to go into a career that would allow her to do just that. And sometimes you just know at 12 years old, she no longer wanted to shoot deer when she went hunting with Jim. Instead, she would point them out and say, "Daddy, look at that deer," and then they would all get scared away. Jim said, jokingly, that that was the last time she ever went hunting with him. She did begin having some issues at school when she was in the 8th grade. It was a tough time for her. Robin recalls having to race over to the school to find out that Nikki was in trouble yet again. She was a tough girl, and she was very outspoken. If she took issue with something, she would let it be known, and not everyone liked that. This didn't end after middle school. Nikki was known to stick up for herself and was someone you should not mess with. Jim said that he taught all of his kids to defend themselves, and she did. But her outspoken nature actually came from her mama. Nikki attended Mountain View High School, where she met a lot of people. She had a number of very close friends, both guys and girls. She liked to have a lot of fun, but she did have an issue staying out of trouble when she did. I've said it before, she had this tough side to her, and unfortunately it led her to getting into physical fights, and one of them ended up in a suspension. Nikki really needed an outlet, something that she could give her energy to so that she would kind of stay out of trouble. She knew she wanted to go to college and become either a veterinarian or a marine biologist. When she was old enough, she even got a tattoo of a dolphin on her left shoulder because she loved dolphins and wolves. She had a soft spot for both, so she decided to volunteer at the Humane Society of Central Oregon. This led her to find out about an amazing opportunity to work at a wolf sanctuary. Despite all of the demands of high school and her social life, she was determined to pursue her passion, which, if you haven't guessed, was animals. When she was finally old enough, she took a job at that wolf sanctuary to gain more hands-on experience. When she was working, she wasn't just standing around on the sidelines watching. No, she wasn't. Nikki was always getting her hands dirty, cleaning out stalls or handling all the animals. She was up for every challenge, which included possibly going into the Marine Corps. That was something else on her list, just like her dad. So that was another outlet for her. She enrolled in the Junior Reserve Officers Training Corps at Mountain View High. She wanted to be more regimented and work on her grades, so she also participated in the Oregon Youth Challenge program. Now, this was sponsored by the Oregon National Guard. It's designed to teach teens work skills and discipline, and it helped Nikki tremendously. So much so that she wanted to give back. During her teen years, in the summers between her sophomore and junior year, and her junior and senior year, Nikki worked with the Youth Conservation Corps. The teens in this program are given schooling and work skill training. They would take on projects to help improve public lands. And Nikki, she was always thinking of others. She even saved enough money that she would buy other people things, and one of the things she bought was for her mom. It was a beautiful silver cross pendant, and it had gold leaves on it. You can tell from everything I've told you that Nikki is compassionate, she's caring, and she loves people. During her senior year, Nikki actually moved on-site at the wolf sanctuary. Her everyday routine consisted of living and taking care of these animals, and a bus would transport her to and from school. After Nikki graduated in 2001, she actually decided to continue living and working at the wolf sanctuary. She began working with horses too, and she would do guided tours for people that came to visit. Finally, in the fall of 2001, Nikki wanted a change, sort of. She wanted to come back and live with her family, and of course, she was welcomed with open arms. The thing is, she did have to move into her old room with her little sister Amanda, and there was some sibling rivalry there. She was actually very close with her brother. They were attached at the hip anytime they were together. But Amanda had her own group of friends. She enjoyed kind of doing her own thing. But the sisters did get along very well. They just went through that typical time when there are two teenagers living under the same roof and in one bedroom. So even though they had their normal disagreements, as teens usually do, they loved each other and liked spending time together with their family. When Nikki moved back in, she quickly got a job, and actually a number of them over the next few years. This is not too uncommon for a teen. She would start working somewhere, get a few paychecks, get a little money, and then quit. She just didn't know exactly what she wanted to do yet. But one thing was certain: Nikki always knew how to make friends. Her mom remembers her bringing a new friend home every week, and she would have no idea where she met this person. But many times, Nikki would also move out and live with those friends here and there, but then she would come back to live with her family. And even when she wasn't living under their roof, she wouldn't go more than a couple of days without seeing them. They thought it was always nice having Nikki around, and they were so happy when she came back to live with them again. In September of 2004, the holidays were right around the corner, and the Hutchings family always looked forward to spending time together. I told you that this was a Halloween-related case. Well, the kids in Bend, Oregon, like many other children across the United States, liked to get dressed up for Halloween and go trick-or-treating. Almost every house was decorated and waiting for kids to come knocking. But as the Hutchings kids got older, they grew out of trick-or-treating and would rather spend time at parties or doing other festive activities. By 2004, the Hutchings family had relocated to a similar 3-bedroom, 2-bath home about 15 minutes away from where they previously were living. Now this area is much more populated. You can see lots of houses. It's a suburban area. Their home was on the end of a cul-de-sac with breathtaking mountain views in the Wishing Well subdivision. It was Halloween night on Sunday, October 31st in 2004. Nikki was 21, Amanda was 17, and Tim was 13. That morning, Amanda got ready for work for her job at a local department store nearby. She was expecting to get done somewhere around 7:45 p.m. Amanda did not drive yet, and she relied on either her parents or her older sister Nikki to pick her up and drop her off when she needed to go anywhere. So even though Amanda's workplace was within walking distance from their home, she did not like walking home alone in the dark at night, especially on Halloween night. So she asked Nikki if she could come get her later, but Nikki had plans of her own. She wanted to stay home and hand out candy. So she said, "You know what? Dad will be out of work by then. He'll probably opt to just swing by and pick you up." Jim did everything for his family, especially his kids, and he was more than happy to go get Amanda that night. He didn't want her to walk home all by herself. He called being a dad his #1 job, even though his actual job was a local bus driver. Nikki wanted to be home at night for those trick-or-treaters. Before Amanda left, Nicole turned to her in a serious tone and asked her if she could talk to her about something important when she got home. It seemed like Nikki had something on her mind, so Amanda agreed that she would, and then she left. The day started out perfectly normal. Robin and Nikki got the candy ready for the kids, and Jim went off to work. Later that evening, when he came home, the family had fun handing out some candy for a bit, until Jim had to leave to go get Amanda and run a few errands. There had been many knocks on that door that night, one after the other, but there was one right before 1 p.m. that was different. It was too late to be trick-or-treaters, and Robin was taking care of the household chores, so Nikki went to see who it was. It wouldn't have been her dad and sister, who they were expecting home any minute because they wouldn't need to knock. So she had no idea who would be at their doorstep that night. When she opened the door, she was surprised to see a couple of her close friends standing outside. They were on their way to a nearby Halloween party at a mutual friend's house and wanted to know if Nikki was interested in coming along. So Nikki, Being 21, definitely liked to hang out, party, and have a few drinks, especially on a festive night like Halloween. So she said yes. She told her friends she would be right back, and she quickly went inside to let her mom know that she'd be going to a friend's Halloween party. Robin didn't even think twice about it. It was completely typical of Nikki. She was very independent, but responsible enough to at least let her parents know where she was going and check in. Robin just told Nikki to be safe and have fun. She had no idea that would be the last time she saw her daughter. The last goodbye. The last time she would see her smile, as she was excited to have some fun that night. It was her very last Halloween with Nikki, one that would be undoubtedly etched into her memory forever. When Nikki got to the Halloween party, it was filled with a bunch of her friends, as well as people that she didn't know. Some were in full-on costumes, so you couldn't even make out who they were, while other people came dressed in normal, everyday clothing. That is how Nikki went, because it was a choice that she made at the very last minute. But there was dancing, of course, loud music, drinking, all while being surrounded by Halloween decorations. This party extended past midnight into the early morning hours of November 1st. As everyone fell back into their post-spooky season normality, the Hutchings household was getting up for a typical Monday morning. That's when Jim noticed that Nikki wasn't around, so he checked her room, and she wasn't there. He had no idea that she had gone out the night before. The last time he saw her, she was in her room filling out job applications. By the time he came home with Amanda, he had no idea she had already left. But when he couldn't find her that morning, Robin let him know that she attended a Halloween party at a friend's house the night before. When he heard this, Jim was like, "Oh, okay, that makes sense. She was probably drinking, and she decided to sleep over at a friend's house." He figured she would call and check in or show back up at the house by the afternoon. Maybe she slept in after a long night. I mean, she hadn't even left until a little after 10 p.m. Typically, the morning after a Halloween party, or any party, isn't nearly as fun and glamorous as the night before, when you're all dressed up in your costume or your cute outfit, and you've had a few drinks. You feel emboldened to do things you wouldn't normally do if your face was showing without the mask or you were sober. And that following morning always comes with a healthy dose of reality. Groggy partygoers wake up with busting hangovers and their faces still caked with last night's makeup. When the dark cloud of Halloween is lifted and the costumes are tucked away and the makeup is washed off, everyone goes back to their typical lives in the real world. But Nikki still wasn't home by late afternoon, and she hadn't called her family, so they started to question why. It wasn't like her to be that out of touch. Jim and Robin also noticed that Nikki had left the night before without her purse or her ID. Both were still in her bedroom. Now granted, this was a house party with friends. She wouldn't have had to show proof that she was 21 years old and she got a ride. But it also signaled to them that Nikki intended to come home in a reasonable amount of time, since at some point she would need her belongings. It's true, if someone has a purse or wallet that they use all the time, they're probably not going to even leave that behind at all. And if they do, it's because they figure they'll be right back. So now Nikki's family is growing concerned. They still weren't that worried, but they did begin calling a number of Nikki's friends, and there were a lot to get in touch with. They were hoping that at least one of them was with her or knew where she was. This went on into the evening, and the family had called everyone who was close to Nikki and then began calling her acquaintances, people she babysat for. They just wanted to exhaust all avenues before taking the dreaded next step of calling the police. But no one knew where Nikki was, and now there was a reason to be concerned. They knew if Nikki was just with friends, she would have let them know, especially if she wasn't coming back home. This is when the Hutchings started to have a very bad feeling, and they reached out to Bend Police Department. Something I didn't know before researching this case is that there is actually a spike in crimes during certain holidays in America, and Halloween is one of them. I figured New Year's, but that's more drunk driving deaths. However, Independence Day and Halloween rank high as times of the year when violent crime, in particular, tends to go up. Now I do holiday homicides, and now I know why I stumble upon such heartbreaking stories at times when people are usually looking forward to the holiday cheer. The types of crimes that typically go up on July 4th and Halloween are burglaries, carjackings, vandalism, and alcohol-related crimes like underage drinking. At Christmas and New Year's, sadly, there's a spike in more domestic crimes, and that's sad and shocking. The police in Bend, Oregon, actually dread going on patrol during Halloween night. It's one of the worst nights of the year for them. It's as though the darkness of the night, dedicated to evil, provides a veil for real-life monsters to lurk in those shadows. The police are not used to getting calls for adults going missing, and when they do, you probably know what they assume, that these people want to disappear, that they've left on their own free will. But they still take these reports seriously. Sometimes they just approach them a little differently. But there were some red flags right away in this case. For one, Nikki left her ID and purse behind, as we know. Then she got a ride from someone, and no one knew where she was or who that was. There were a lot of unknowns. What the Bend police did know was that Nikki was 21 years old, 5 feet 4 inches tall, weighed 160 pounds, and had brown hair and blue eyes. The other unique identifiers were that she had a slight gap between her 2 front teeth, a pierced tongue with a silver barbell, and tattoos of a rose and a dolphin on the back of her left shoulder. She was last seen wearing a maroon polo shirt with the words City of Bend on it and black windbreaker-style pants with white tennis shoes. The Bend Police Department sent Detective Brian Candell out to meet the Hutchings and take a detailed report. He talked to Robin, Amanda, and Jim, and they told him everything we already know. But there were a couple of things that I haven't gone into detail about. First, Amanda kept stressing that her sister wouldn't leave like this. Then she mentioned something that stood out, the fact that right before leaving for work, Nikki stopped her and told her she had something important to talk to her about. Then she recalled Nikki just telling her, "I love you, and I'll see you later." But she never did see her later, so she can't help but wonder what Nikki wanted to confide in her about. That bothered Amanda. She felt like it might have something to do with why she's gone. That would be very haunting, not knowing what Nikki was hiding or wanted to get off her chest. The other new piece of evidence is that Nikki had a boyfriend named Bobby. She'd been seeing him for a while, and at first Jim and Robin liked him. He seemed really nice and got along with the whole family. Things seemed to work out really nicely between him and Nikki. But as time went on, the Hutchings felt like they were seeing more of Bobby's true colors, and they did not like the way he treated Nikki. He seemed to take advantage of her, and they had reason to believe that things could have gotten physical between them. So now, since Nikki's missing, they're questioning whether Bobby could be responsible. By the next day, Nikki still had not shown up. This was November 2nd, and there really wasn't much to go on. But Detective Candell wanted to track Bobby down to see if he had any additional information for them. He also wanted to find out if any of Nikki's friends could provide more information about the location of the Halloween party, as well as the host and everyone that was in attendance that night. They would need to question everyone. Meanwhile, the Hutchings were now in a panic. A whole day had gone by, 24 hours, with no word from Nikki. It was hard to go about normal activities when a huge piece of your life is missing. All they could do was wait, and Jim felt like the worst part was not knowing where Nikki was. Detectives tracked Bobby down and asked him if he knew where Nikki was. He essentially told them it was not his job to keep tabs on his ex-girlfriend, and that piqued their interest. Ex-girlfriend? Since when, they wondered? He let them know right away that he and Nikki broke up over that past weekend, just a couple of days before she attended that Halloween party and was not seen again. That raised a red flag. Had the breakup turned into something more sinister or even deadly? In order to rule Bobby out, the detectives told him they would like to have a formal interview with him, and they would like him to take a polygraph. I know they're not reliable enough to be used as evidence in court, but they can be used as a tool to detect deception, and that could be a big clue for them. Bobby was asked questions related to whether he had anything to do with Nikki's disappearance, and it turned out there was no deception detected in his responses. He also had an alibi for Halloween night, and it was able to be confirmed. Now, this doesn't mean that they just checked him off their list as a potential suspect. It just means, for the time being, they can continue looking in other directions that might bring in more viable leads. But they didn't have any. And days just kept passing, and Nikki's family, was not doing well. Amanda was having a very hard time dealing with the emptiness that she felt. She said it left a hole that was just empty space in her life, and she described it as horrifying. The family, and even the police, began monitoring her credit cards and bank statements, but there was no recent activity. The local daily newspaper and media outlet, called the Bend Bulletin, began posting about Nikki's disappearance, and the Bend Police Department put out their own news release asking anyone with information to please contact Detective Brian Kell. They were still in the process of tracking down all of those partygoers from Halloween night. And finally, one woman that they were interviewing, named Mary, said that not only was she a friend of Nikki, but she was at the party, and it was thrown at the house she lived in. So of course they wanted to know details. Mary explained she lived with 2 roommates, both of them were men. Lauren Bowers and the other was Craig Whiting. They threw a big Halloween party that night. They invited a bunch of their friends, including Nikki, who was very good friends with both of them. Now Lauren had a girlfriend who had 2 kids, one was 6 and the other was 4, and Nikki would come over to babysit them all the time, and that's how she met Mary. As far as the party was concerned, Mary said that there was nothing out of the ordinary, but she wasn't able to give a full account of everyone in attendance because there were a lot of people coming and going that night. Some even brought their own friends. But at least they had 2 names of people they could reach out to. They wasted no time. They got the address, and detectives went over to Lauren and Craig's to see if they could provide them with any new leads. When they arrived, the house was packed with a bunch of friends. The roommates were just hanging out. They asked to speak to 34-year-old Lauren and 23-year-old Craig separately. Both of them said the same thing. They explained they had known Nikki for a long time. Craig told them that he was a very close friend with her and her family. He even lived with them for quite some time when he was trying to find a place of his own. Lauren explained that he had been best friends with Craig, and they lived together with Mary at the house where the Halloween party was held, the one that the officers were standing in front of at that moment. They explained that they planned this party earlier that month, and Craig added that he was actually the one who came to Nikki's house that night. He thought Nikki could use a night out, and he was in the area, so he stopped by to ask her if she wanted to come over. Maybe he knew about the breakup, and you know how that goes sometimes. When you're finally single, you get to hang out more. Everyone living in Lauren's house was interviewed, but none of them knew where Nikki might be. They said the party was packed, and the last time they thought they saw her was probably around midnight. They were all drinking, and many partygoers were heavily intoxicated that night. Nikki's friends were genuinely worried about her. They weren't overly concerned at this point. They were just all hoping that she would turn back up. But no one had heard from her or seen her since that night. If they did provide anything, it was more of their own opinions instead of facts, like giving possibilities of where Nikki might be. Maybe she left with someone, or did you talk to her boyfriend? Things like that. However, the detectives were able to get more names of friends who were there that night, and when asked if they remembered seeing Nikki, many said they didn't. If anyone said they did, it was maybe for a few minutes. It was kind of like she was invisible that night. No one really recalled when she left or even seeing her leave. They don't remember anything that stood out to them. For example, if she had been the last to leave the party with a whole bunch of other people, maybe somebody would remember that. Like we closed it down. There were no significant interactions that took place to put a time on when they recalled seeing her last, if at all. It is tough. You don't go into a party or anywhere saying, I better remember everything I saw because I'm going to be questioned about this later. It's hard to rack your brain after the fact. Now, detectives wonder if Nikki wandered out of this house on her own that night. Did she get intoxicated and walk off? Did she get kidnapped? Was there a stranger in this house with bad intentions? But they weren't much further in this investigation. When Nikki's family was asked about Lauren and Craig, it was kind of a dead end. They echoed the same things that the guys had told the detectives. Jim confirmed that Craig is a close friend of Nikki's. Everyone loved him. They called him Baby Huey because he was a big goofy guy and a good guy. So this helped detectives move along and expand the search outward to other states. Now Nikki's picture, all her information, and details surrounding her disappearance were shared across agencies all over the country. Since they didn't have any new leads, they decided to run some background checks on everyone living at the house that hosted the party, as well as people that were in attendance. They had to start somewhere, and there weren't that many things that stood out. If anyone had a record, there were no violent crimes. Craig didn't have any offenses, but there was one thing that looked questionable in regard to Nikki's good friend, Lauren Bowers. It's something that stunned everyone close to him, especially Nikki's family. It turned out that Lauren was a registered sex offender. I think you know what that means, and it's not good. No one knew. Nikki's dad remembers getting that news and being floored. He could not imagine that at all. The charge, in case you're wondering, was from a decade before this, and it was for intercourse with someone underage. This man was 24 at the time. So of course, Dr. Kandel goes back to confront Lauren about his past, and he's very open about it. He explains that it was a mistake. It's something from my past. It happened a long time ago, and he's moved forward. It had been, I think, a decade by then, and he wants to keep it in the past. He told them that he would do whatever they needed in order to cooperate in Nikki's case. This is pretty disturbing, and it makes me wonder if anyone close to him knew about this. I mean, he was registered, but as it related to Nikki's case at hand, there was no connection or evidence that Lauren or anyone else they interviewed knew anything. Plus, at this point, it's still a missing persons case. They didn't have any real evidence to connect to anyone. They were still in the information gathering phase. Now, Nikki's family organized a local search effort in Bend. They distributed flyers with her picture and a description, and several members of her family spoke to local media, asking anyone with information to contact law enforcement. That's when people started to come forward. They were telling police that they had seen Nikki, and this made her family so hopeful. But the problem was, none of these eyewitness accounts could be confirmed. As a bus driver, Jim found himself driving by Drake Park every time he was working, just keeping his eyes out for anyone that looked like his daughter. The whole family was having a hard time believing that this was their new reality, but they were really trying to hold on to hope that Nikki would be found, and found alive. Every time they saw someone that resembled her, they stopped and took a closer look, and every time a knock came to the door, they thought it could be Nikki, but it wasn't. Then, things took a darker turn. There were 3 separate tipsters who came forward and told the police to look into a guy known as Spider. The reason why was pretty terrifying. Apparently, this man had admitted to killing Nikki and burying her body on his property. Yet, that would definitely be a reason to look into him, so they made the Spider person their main priority. After digging deeper, they found out his real name is Danny Shane. He's also a convicted felon and is associated with a local and violent gang known as the Park Rats. The name might be kind of silly, but their actions were nothing to laugh about. They had been committing offenses on people in the downtown Bend area, targeting Drake Park specifically. That's where the name came from, Park Rats. But that's also a location that Nikki frequented. It was not the safest place at night. During the day, beautiful, but at night it was being overrun by homeless encampments. There were alcohol-related offenses going on, and natural risks as well, like wild animals coming out and roaming the area. So many locals knew better than to go there at night. This particular gang had been known to be involved in drug dealing, and Spider specifically had a bad reputation for harassing people. He was also the so-called gang leader, so they apprehended him and brought him in for questioning. When the name Spider was mentioned to Nikki's family, the detectives were surprised that they were actually familiar with Danny. They did not know him personally, but Jim and Amanda had both heard the name before because Nikki went to high school with Danny, or Spider, and he had changed a lot since then. Jim definitely made it clear he was not a fan. So the detectives asked Spider how he knew Nikki, and he said high school. They asked when the last time he talked to her was, and he said he thought it was a few weeks ago. Well, that lines up with when she went missing. So they asked whether there was an issue between the two of them, and he looked at them genuinely confused and said no. That's when they let him know that Nikki was missing. So, you know what he tells them? He tells them that she probably wanted to go somewhere if she was gone. That's not the best answer. So, they go one step further and give him a polygraph, which Danny agrees to, and he passes with no deception. But it was so hard not to think that he knew more than he was letting on. I mean, those are pretty harsh allegations, that he's going around telling people he killed Nikki and she was buried on his property. After letting him go, the Bend Police Department sent out helicopters to fly over Danny's house and the land that he lived on. They were looking for disturbed ground where a grave could have been dug, but they were not able to locate anything. It's been a few weeks now, and they were scanning for a grave, which meant there was a possibility that they believed Nikki could be dead. Her family had already been preparing themselves to get that kind of news, because weeks turned into months, and still nothing. The chances of her being alive didn't seem high. Something I wanted to mention is that Nikki's little brother, Tim, was only 13, and he had a very hard time understanding that someone could just be gone. It's not something that parents think about explaining to their children. They don't ever think they're going to have to explain that their sibling just vanishes. It's not something we usually teach our children about because we don't ever want that to be the case in our own family. Jim said that Tim worshipped the ground that Nikki walked on. He was completely lost without his big sister, and the whole family felt disconnected. They all had a new purpose, and that was finding Nikki. It consumed them day in and day out. Amanda didn't even know who she was without being a younger sister to Nikki. Her whole identity was in crisis. It was like they could not move forward without answers. It wasn't long after this that the Hutchings were contacted by the Portland, Oregon Police Department. It's not a call that any family wants to receive. They were told that a body had been found, and it matched Nikki's description. So they wanted someone from the family to make an identification. It wasn't long after this that the Hutchings were contacted by the Portland, Oregon Police Department. It's not a call that any family wants to receive. They were told that a body had been found, and it matched Nikki's description. So they wanted someone from the family to make an identification. Everyone was in shock, but Jim decided to ask one question. Did the victim have a tattoo of a dolphin on her left shoulder? As they waited to hear back, I'm sure it was agonizing. When the officer called Jim and informed him that there was not a tattoo located on this person, as harsh as it sounds, they were relieved that it wasn't Nikki. But it was heartbreaking that somewhere out there was a family that lost someone. Sadly, now the Hutchings knew what it was like to get a phone call like that, and they were hoping they wouldn't have to experience the reality of it. But we know the story doesn't end well. Finally, there seemed to be some surprisingly good news. Detectives had continued to track Nikki's credit card, her bank account, and cell phone, and after a few months, their persistence eventually paid off. The detectives received a hit on one of Nicole's credit cards, and they were excited. This was an indication that Nikki was still out there. They just needed to track down where these purchases were made. They didn't waste any time. They immediately reached out to the Hutchings, and Robin answered. They let her know the news about all hope was dashed when Robin admitted that it was actually her that used that account. It was not Nikki. That would be tough because you're expecting to hear some good news, and then it's not. It's nothing. It's another dead end. After so many months went by, the calls from detectives came in less and less because the case was growing colder and colder. Life was standing still for the Hutchings. Amanda was a senior in high school, and she was so excited about applying to colleges earlier that year and eagerly awaiting her acceptance letters. But now, none of that seemed important. Eventually, she did learn that she had not only been accepted to a university in Minnesota, but she got a full scholarship, and she was overjoyed to hear this news. But at the same time, she could not leave her family. Not at a time like this. The question about what happened to Nikki would linger for close to 3 long years. As it turned out, there was someone hiding something. They knew what happened. It took them that long to build up the courage to come forward and reveal that secret. In March of 2007, a woman that I'm going to call Jenny came into the Bend police station wanting to speak with an officer. She's an old friend of Nikki's, and she wants to come forward with information about her disappearance now. For some background, they find out they had already interviewed Jenny back when they were questioning everyone who attended the Halloween party. She was there. She was the girlfriend of Lauren Bowers, the one with the 6-year-old and the 4-year-old child at the time. She's the mother of one of Lauren's children, the younger one, but they had a pretty rocky relationship and had since broken up. That is what prompted her to speak up, and what she says astonishes the detectives. They asked her what happened, and Jenny said that Lauren killed Nikki. They wanted to know how she knew that, and Jenny admitted that Lauren told her he was going to kill Nikki that night. Later, she saw her show up at that house, and she knew it wasn't going to be good. That is a lot to keep inside. She goes on to explain that she remembers a couple of days after Lauren told her that he was going to kill Nikki, and then she showed up at the Halloween party. That's when police came to their door and told them she was missing. Jenny was questioned, but at the time, she lied. She said it had been a few weeks since she saw Nikki last, but that wasn't true. She told them she lied because she was scared. She says that Lauren actually threatened her, saying if she ever told anyone, he would shoot her in the head, right between the eyes, actually. This wasn't the first time he told her not to talk, so she kept quiet. But this was merely words. It was a story. There was no solid proof at this point. There wasn't even a body. So the detectives devised a plan. They asked Jenny if she thought that Lauren would talk to her about the whole situation, and she said she thought he would. So this woman bravely agreed to wear a wire and meet with Lauren while the cops were standing by with rifles, listening in to make sure that Jenny wasn't in any danger. She arranged to meet Lauren at a park to talk, and the plan seemed to work. Lauren met with Jenny, and she told him she wanted to know everything that happened to Nikki. Lauren asked Jenny if he could trust her. When she said yes, he revealed that Nikki was trying to destroy Lauren's life with Jenny. He didn't know what else he was supposed to do, and he would rather be dead than go back to jail. He actually said he would rather take his own life than go back to jail. But detectives had no idea what Lauren was referring to. But instead, Lauren started to become agitated with Jenny, asking more and more probing questions. He wanted to know why all of a sudden she wanted to know about all this. He said, "How come before you didn't want to talk to me about none of this, and all of a sudden now you want to talk?" "Because it's been bugging me," she replied. He got suspicious and point-blank asked Jenny if she told the cops he had done something. Then he asked her if she was wearing a wire. Jenny of course said no, saying, "You actually believe that I would wear an effing wire?" I guess that was convincing, but Lauren ironically explained that Jenny had no idea how good the technology was. They could tap anything. This was 2007, so imagine how far it's come now. He said, "Why are you asking me these questions? Did you tell the cops I did something? You actually believe I would wear a wire? You don't understand the technology they have now. They can tap anything." But this was not going well for Jenny. However, somehow she knew how to calm him down enough for him to admit that, in his words, he had gotten rid of her. Okay, that was enough to arrest Lauren Bowers. It was at the very least an admission that he knew what happened to Nikki, and that he had something to do with it, even if he wasn't the person that actually did it. They apprehended him a few days later, on March 12th, not to tip off that Jenny helped them. More in-depth background checks revealed that Lauren was a twice-convicted sex offender who was sentenced to nearly 2 years in 1995 for first- and third-degree forcible intercourse. Go look it up. It's not good. The victims were 13 to 16 years old. After his release from prison in 1997, he dropped out of the offender program altogether and stopped reporting to his probation officer for quite some time. He had also been convicted of being a felon in possession of a firearm, theft, and giving false information to police. So they were thinking they probably wouldn't get someone that would cooperate with them in this investigation. But they were wrong, because as soon as Lauren sat down, he was in tears. He was begging them to believe that he had nothing to do with this. He was saying someone else was involved, and that person was probably going to try to pin everything on Lauren. So who's this other person? Well, according to Lauren, it was none other than his very best friend, Craig Whiting. You know, the guy who came to pick Nikki up the night of the party? the close friend of hers who knew her family for years, who Jim called the big goofy good guy. Why would you have a reason to hurt Nikki? These people were all close. Well, Detective Kendall, who had already spoken to Craig back when he did his initial investigation, called him back in for a follow-up interview and got right to the point. He said, "Listen, we know what happened, and you're close friends with this family. They took you in when you had nothing. It's time for you to do the right thing and admit what you have done to their daughter." You could physically see Craig take a deep breath, and detectives thought, okay, he is going to spill. They asked him who was the mastermind behind Nikki's disappearance, and he said the mastermind was Lauren. So how was Craig involved? Well, according to him, Lauren asked Craig to help him get rid of Nikki. When Detective Kendall asked, "What does that mean to you? Get rid of or take care of her?" Craig just said, "Probably killing her." He was so nonchalant. But why though? Craig said that it all started when Nikki, in his words, began spreading rumors about Lauren that he had touched one of the children inappropriately, really that Nikki babysat for. And if that got out, it's something that could put Lauren back in jail. Nikki babysat for a few of the people who lived at Lauren's, and one of the mother's young children came to her and told her that Lauren did something inappropriate and took pictures of her without clothes. Well, this was serious. Nikki was also in fear for the children due to drug-related activities that she witnessed going on at that house. So this was it. Nikki brought this information to the mother of that child, and the mother confronted Lauren about it. Now, I don't know who this child was, whether this was one of Jenny's children, the one that's not biologically Lauren's, because this was a 6-year-old, and we know that Jenny had a 6-year-old at the time. If you recall on The Wire, Lauren explicitly said that Nikki was trying to ruin his life with Jenny. That could merely mean that he knew if he went to jail, they would no longer be a couple, or it could be something more. Whoever it was whose child was involved, when their mother confronted Lauren, he went into a rage. He was punching walls and asked them, "Who told you this?" When they admitted it was Nikki, he told them he would kill Nikki. So this does sound like what Jenny admitted to. Then he went on to say something so disgusting and chilling. He said that he had holes in the ground around Smith Rock and Sun River that could swallow Nikki up. It turned out that when detectives looked into these allegations, they were not rumors. Nikki had gone one step further and filed an actual complaint with the Oregon Department of Human Services, alleging that Lauren was inappropriate with the child and exposed them to a drug-filled environment. But how does Craig fit into all of this? Remember, he doesn't even have a criminal record. When they were waiting for him to hopefully confess everything that happened, they stumbled upon a very frightening detail about Craig's past, one that makes them question whether he could be capable of hurting anyone, especially a woman. Back when Craig was only 11 years old, he and his mother, Margaret, who went by Peggy and was 38 at the time, were living with Peggy's boyfriend, 40-year-old John Ma, in his double-wide mobile home in Anchorage, Alaska. Peggy went missing between April 25th and 27th of 1992. When she didn't show up at work, her sister, Suzanne, was alerted. She ended up calling Peggy's boyfriend, who told her that Peggy had gone on a drunken vacation in Seattle. He claimed he had been receiving calls from her, saying she would return on May 28th. But when she didn't show up, her co-workers filed a missing persons report. She had been gone for 5 weeks at this point. On May 30th, Peggy's sister flew out to Anchorage and showed up unannounced at the mobile home where her nephew, Craig, was living with John. When John opened the door, he apologized immediately for the terrible smell and said that Peggy's dogs, his words, had pottied inside the house. At this point, Suzanne hadn't even noticed the smell at all, but the whole situation seemed very suspicious. So, she took 11-year-old Craig with her and left. A few days later, Suzanne went back to the mobile home to get some of her nephew's things, and that's when she noticed the entire place had been cleaned from top to bottom. It reeked of pine. Again, John said, "I'm sorry, I was just trying to get rid of the doggy smell." Meanwhile, the Anchorage Police Department learned that John was on parole for burglary, robbery, and theft. After interviewing several people, there were so many inconsistencies in his story. Not only that, but friends of Peggy came forward, saying that she had told them she and John had been fighting in the weeks leading up to her disappearance. One time, he even tried to choke her. Without going into too much detail to derail from Nikki's case, I'll tell you what you can probably guess. Craig's mom, Peggy, she was dead. And poor Craig had been living among his mother's corpse this entire time. John had crammed her into the crawl space underneath the double-wide trailer and then lied to Craig, saying that his mother ran off and left him. Can you imagine, at 11 years old, feeling like your mom did that to you? All the while, John was going down there and pouring bottle after bottle of pine over Peggy's remains to hide the smell of decomposition. Once John knew that they found Peggy, he told the police he killed her, but it was all in self-defense. Isn't it always? His story was that on the night of the killing, Peggy came home drunk and attacked him in his sleep. She was yelling at him and berating him for not going to a bar with her. John said he had to fight back, so he grabbed whatever was nearby, and that was a large, heavy metal ashtray. He took it and swung it at Peggy, smashing her head in. But to his surprise, she continued to yell and struggle. So, he stuffed socks in her mouth to silence her. As the situation escalated, he tied her arms and hands with rope, and then he tied the rope around her neck, ultimately choking her to death. Then he wrapped her body in plastic and lowered her into that crawl space beneath the double-wide trailer. That is so disgusting, and poor Craig, we will never know what he witnessed. If he was home that night, he surely must have heard something behind those thin walls. So after John's confession, he was sentenced to 99 years in prison, and there was little Craig in the courtroom, holding a box containing his mother's ashes. Knowing that Craig's own mother had been murdered, would he ever condone an act like this? Did he really have anything to do with this, or was his older best buddy trying to pin it all on him? Well, back in the interview room, Detective Candell asked Craig, "Did Nikki do anything to you to upset you?" And he said no, she hadn't. What he admitted to next blows my mind. He said that he figured since Lauren was his best friend, he should be able to do anything for his best friend, even murder. Yeah, Craig admitted he looked to Lauren as his older brother, and if a brother asks you to do something, you help them out. If you can do it, you do it. And when bluntly asked, even commit murder? Craig said yes. But had he, or was he just covering for Lauren? They needed more to go on, but wow, the lengths that some people will go for loyalty. Detective Candell said this was deeply disturbing to him. It would be for most of us who are human beings. To get a confession from Lauren, they told him that they had him on tape admitting that he had gotten rid of Nikki. He refused to admit that he said that, but we know he did because we heard it, and they were there and saw his demeanor change. That's when they told him, "We talked to Craig, and it's time to allow Nikki's parents to bury their daughter." But it would take 2 whole days so they could piece together exactly what happened. They got it out of them with the most important piece of evidence, where Nikki was. To avoid being sentenced to death, Craig agreed to show Detective Vincent and Candell where they buried Nikki's body. The detectives made note that Craig's remorse, well, there was none. It was like he accidentally ran over a cat. But what they meant was that it seemed like this wasn't a big deal to him. He didn't have an ounce of compassion. How can people like this exist? I don't know, but meanwhile, Lauren was still making confessions about exactly what happened. I will tell you everything after I explain where Craig instructed the detectives to look. It was a very remote area, about 20 miles out, in the middle of a forest off a fire road. This area is southeast of the town of Sun River. Remember, Jenny said that Lauren told her he had holes in Sun River that would swallow Nikki up. This is probably only about 35 to 40 minutes away from where they had that Halloween party. But the detectives admitted they would have never looked here. More than a dozen officers, crime scene technicians, and search personnel went out there to assist, and a cadaver dog was brought out to sniff for human remains. Craig led them to an area in the middle of the trees, where he said he and Lauren made sure to put a partially burned log over the site where Nikki was. But this had been almost 3 years, and there was a lot out there. But there's a lot of logs out there, and they didn't know exactly where the location was. But it didn't take them long to narrow it down, and they began digging using shovels and buckets in a 4x6 area. Here are some pictures of this excavation on the screen. Finally that evening, in a shallow grave, officers found probable human remains that they believed belonged to Nicole Hutchings. Now was the time to hear the whole story and to charge both Lauren Bowers and Craig Whiting with the murder of Nicole Hutchings. Putting together both confessions, detectives were able to ascertain that Lauren wanted to silence Nikki. She was doing all she could to defend this innocent child and keep them safe, only to be met with a monster who'd rather have her destroyed than face the consequences of his own disgusting actions. So, back in early October 2004, Lauren devised a plan with his bestie Craig to get rid of Nikki. They needed a way to get her alone though, so they thought of something simple, something innocuous, and they came up with throwing a big Halloween party and inviting the entire neighborhood, all of their friends, including Nikki. But the night before this big bash, they went out to that remote location and dug a 3-foot grave, a shallow 3-foot grave, knowing that they planned to kill Nikki the very next night to put her inside there. Then, on the night of October 31st, Craig was the one who went over there and convinced Nikki to come have some fun. Lauren did his best to stay kind of out of sight that night, and he let Craig handle serving Nikki drink after drink of what they called jungle punch. But Nikki's was spiked with Vicodin, and it didn't take long for poor Nikki to be barely coherent. She was unable to walk without assistance and was totally out of it. And that's when they got her into Lauren's truck, and Craig told the investigators he was hammered. He drove Lauren and an incapacitated Nikki out to the makeshift gravesite. Once they were there, Craig agreed to make it quick. He wanted to get it over with. Quickly, they dragged her out of the vehicle to where the grave was dug. Then Craig took what's called a tire buddy. This is a heavy metal-tipped instrument, like a club. It's used to check tire pressure on vehicles. I'm showing one on the screen. It kind of looks like a bat or a wooden stick. It's 16 inches long, and he took it and swung it at the back of Nikki's head at full force. He thought he could kill her in one strike, but when she was knocked down, she proceeded to get back up. She was not dead. That's when Lauren grabbed this club-like item, taking it right out of Craig's hands, and began pounding Nikki again and again until she was unconscious. But before Nikki stopped breathing, the men stripped her down and dumped her into the hole in the ground. Then they covered her with dirt. This woman was buried alive. She suffocated to death, all alone out in those dark woods, after 2 of her closest friends tricked her on a night reserved for tricks of a more innocent kind. By Tuesday afternoon on March 13th, both men were arrested and charged with 1 count each of aggravated murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and 2 counts of first-degree kidnapping. They were held without bail due to the aggravated circumstances related to the deliberate cruelty involved in this case, and that a weapon was used on a vulnerable victim. The aggravated murder count alleges that these men were trying to cover up the crimes of child neglect and criminal mistreatment by killing Nikki. Lauren was also charged in relation to that young child. Excavation of the site was continuing on Tuesday evening, and the remains were sent to the Oregon State Medical Examiner's Office for confirmation of identification. They said it would be weeks before authorities would know if the remains were 100% confirmed to be Nikki's. The cause of death was still under investigation. They also obtained a search warrant for a Dodge Travelcraft motorhome that was near Lone Cow Drive, which I'm showing here. This is where Lauren was apparently living at the time of his arrest, and it was believed that this was the vehicle Nikki was transported in, and that the instrument used to try to kill her was still inside. Police seized evidence, putting it into brown paper bags, and then they impounded that vehicle for processing at the crime lab. That night, around 9:45, detectives showed up at the Hutchings front door. Jim knew when he saw them that this was something bad. Amanda looked right at the detectives and said, "Please don't tell me that my sister's dead." They looked at her, just shaking their heads back and forth, and she knew. Right then, she collapsed onto the floor. But once everyone was able to gain their composure, the detectives had more bad news. They revealed who was responsible for Nikki's murder, and when her family found out who had done this, they were shocked. Craig, Goofy Craig, who was cared for in their own home. How? And Lauren, Nikki's best friend. Why? Jim said he wished they would both rot in hell. The family was then led into the coroner's office at this time, and Jim will never forget seeing Nikki's dolphin tattoo and knowing that this time it was really her. It was unbelievable. It was the worst news a family could have gotten, but at least she was found, and Jim said she is home. But he also said he would like to save taxpayers' money and take care of these monsters himself. That is how angry he was towards both of them, because how could they do such a thing? Amanda said her sister died a hero. She was killed for protecting a child, for doing the right thing, and it reminded me so much of Allie Lamont. I talked about her case in the beginning of this month, another very sad story. They did not deserve this. A memorial service was held for Nikki on Friday, March 23rd, and her family and friends gathered around to say their goodbyes and to share memories of Nikki. It would be nearly another year until both Lauren and Craig pleaded guilty to Nikki's murder. Lauren would plead guilty in December of 2007, but he did say he never did anything to that child. He said in court, "I want to apologize to give my deepest regrets for the pain and suffering I caused Nicole and her family. I deserve the punishment that has been given." He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Then Craig finally pleaded guilty in February of 2008, and the circuit court judge, Alta Brady, was presiding over his sentencing trial. They were trying to actually decide if he would spend the rest of his life in prison or someday have a chance to get out. I'm thinking, life for sure, but his lawyer brought up the fact that Craig's own mother was murdered, and he tried to use that as some kind of bargaining chip, some reason that this man should be allowed a second chance. But so much was set forth by the deputy district attorney in this case. There was a pathologist who testified that they found dirt in Nikki's lungs, and I was stunned when I heard that, because I was thinking that after all that time passed, her organs wouldn't even be there after decomposition. That led me to conduct some very questionable Google searches, but apparently there are ways to tell. Even if they couldn't, these men admitted she wasn't dead when they dropped her into that grave. Now, they weren't actually able to tell the cause of death because of how decomposed Nikki's body was, so that's why it was a little confusing to me whether or not they were able to tell where the dirt came from. Because if a person is put in a grave and they're covered with dirt, that made me a little bit confused. But in my opinion, if the court accepted this testimony to be reliable and this expert witness was qualified, then I'm going to assume that their testimony was truthful and that there was a way that this could be determined. So the judge concluded that this was premeditated in every sense of the word. It was cold-blooded, and that Craig would still be a danger to others if he was released from prison in the future, because he was, in her words, dysfunctionally susceptible to the influence of others. I had never heard it put that way, but yes, indeed, he was. This is peer pressure to another level. And he didn't even need to be pressured. He was asked, and he complied. Craig Whiting was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Nikki's mother, Robin, sobbed through the whole sentencing hearing, and then she turned and hugged her family. Once it was over, she was so happy that Nikki could finally rest in peace, and she thanked the deputy district attorney for all that she had done. The family didn't know that Nikki was buried alive until that hearing. It was so hard to hear, especially for a loved one, because even for me, to imagine that horrific image in my mind of Nikki's final moments and how scared she must have been. In other cases, I've actually heard people say that it's a good thing if a victim is drugged or they're unconscious, they don't know what's happening. But honestly, either way, this is heartbreaking. The family was glad that it was over, that these two men would never see the light of day. Amanda said that maybe now she could go back to college after she declined that full scholarship back in 2004 when Nikki was still missing. I just hope that somehow this family is able to find some peace, and I'm so sorry for everyone in Nikki's family and all of her loved ones. Her life was only just starting. Her passion was aiding those whose lives had already ended. She never could have anticipated that her 24th birthday would bring not dreams, hopes, or wishes, but death. It takes an exceptional person to want to work in the funeral industry. For one, they must be okay with being surrounded by death daily. Empathy and compassion are two of the most vital characteristics for anyone that wants to enter the funeral industry. They must understand when to give families space and respect the grieving process. Rachel Nicoletta Anderson was one of those people, a person with a pure heart whose passion was to help those who had just lost their loved ones, or even their own lives. Rachel was born in Warren, Ohio on January 28, 1994, to William, Bill, and Patricia Trish Anderson. Rachel had one younger brother, John Anderson, and they grew up in Warren, Ohio. Warren is a relatively small city in northwest Ohio along the Mahoning River. General Motors and Packard Electric are two of the area's biggest employers. Warren has a number of museums, including the Trumbull County Museum and the National Packard Museum. Golf courses, breweries, and a drive-in theater are all nearby as well. The city is described as hip meets blue collar, with a lot of character in downtown Warren. Dave Grohl Alley honors the former Nirvana drummer and Foo Fighters frontman, Dave Grohl, who is a native of Warren. Many people are actually surprised to hear that he's from Warren because they assume he's from the Pacific Northwest, like Kurt Cobain was. Public artwork lines Dave Grohl Alley, and among the works on display are murals, sculptures, and the world's longest drumsticks, which measure 23 feet long. The local high school, Warren G. Harding, named after the U.S. president born in the city, produces excellent athletes. People in Warren love sports, especially local sports, and they spend a lot of their time playing and watching them. The Scrappers, a minor league baseball team, is quite popular among the locals during baseball season. This is where Rachel Anderson grew up, and she graduated from Warren G. Harding High School in 2012. During high school, Rachel was a member of the National Honor Society. However, Rachel was more than just a talented student. She was an exceptional athlete. She played soccer and volleyball, and she also participated in the school band. During high school, Rachel worked at Giant Eagle, a local neighborhood grocery store chain with locations in West Virginia, Indiana, Pennsylvania, Maryland, and Ohio. Rachel loved her job. Anything she did with joy, and to know her was to love her. She would come to work every day with a giant smile on her face. The locals knew Rachel, and she touched the lives of her co-workers and customers. Rachel was beautiful. She had long blonde hair and green eyes, but it wasn't just her physical beauty that drew people to her. She was bubbly, friendly, and had a truly infectious laugh that would make you crack up just hearing it. She really did light up a room when she entered. Rachel's ambition was a little bit different than a lot of other high school graduates. She wanted to become a funeral director and embalmer, which led her to enroll at Youngstown State University after graduating from Warren G. Harding High School. Despite sometimes being confused with one another, funeral directors and embalmers are two different positions or careers. Embalmers sanitize and prepare bodies for burial, while funeral directors work with grieving families, assist with funeral planning services, and oversee all burial or cremation arrangements. Even though both occupations require deep respect for the deceased, embalmers focus more on the science of death, while morticians concentrate on delivering personalized care to the families. After completing the prerequisites at Youngstown State University, Rachel applied to the Cincinnati College of Mortuary Science. This is an acclaimed institution. Joseph Henry Clark founded the Cincinnati College of Mortuary Science, CCMS, in 1882 to train embalmers during the Civil War. In time, CCMS became known as the father of embalming schools. In 1980, CCMS received authorization from Ohio Regents to grant students an Associate of Applied Science degree. All this to say, the College of Mortuary Science at CCMS became the very first private college in the nation to offer a bachelor's degree in mortuary science in 1986. To this day, CCMS has maintained its regional and professional certifications. It's the go-to school if you want to study mortuary science. According to its mission statement, the Cincinnati College of Mortuary Science endeavors to develop professionals who can function with distinction within their chosen profession and within the community of life. They strive to provide the best education possible, and that's exactly why Rachel was excited to enroll. While in mortuary school, Rachel worked at a funeral home, Nagel Club and Islandorf Funeral Home in Norwood, Ohio. The staff taught Rachel a lot, especially the owner, Bernard, who had owned the business since the 1970s. Jackie and Tara, the funeral director and the embalmer, became Rachel's mentors and friends. They were like a second family to her. After graduating from CCMS, Rachel became a member of the Ohio Funeral Directors Association and spent her internship with Shaw Davis Funeral Home in Columbus. Rachel had never been happier. The owner of the funeral home treated her like family. She loved her colleagues and even told her mom, "I will work for them forever." Rachel had no idea what was going to happen. As Rachel got closer to her 24th birthday, her internship at the funeral home was nearly completed, but she wasn't stressed about finding a job because the owner had already offered her a full-time position, which she would have accepted if given the chance. She had plans to stay there permanently. Earlier that month, she even moved from Warren to Columbus to be closer to her job. Her new apartment was on Allegheny Street on the east side of the city. Cute, two-story apartments in the Cardinal Creek apartment complex at 3044 Allegheny Avenue. Rachel's younger brother, John Anderson, wanted to throw her an awesome 24th birthday party, so he got mutual friends together and decided to have it at one of Rachel's friends' houses, Jonathan Kennedy and his wife, Tina. They were more than happy to host her birthday party. They lived across the city, on the west side of Columbus. The party was planned for the night before Rachel's birthday on Saturday, January 27th. Jonathan Kennedy was Rachel's very close friend from Warren G. Harding High School. She also had a close relationship with Jonathan's sister when they were growing up, and they spent a lot of time together. Her brother, John Anderson, still lived in Warren, Ohio, so he had to drive almost 3 hours to Columbus for Rachel's birthday. He planned to spend the entire weekend with her. He arrived on Friday, January 26th, the night before the party, and hung out at Rachel's apartment with Jonathan and Tina. Since Rachel had to work the next day, she gave her brother her primary key so he could come and go while she was gone. Rachel's spare key was already with Tina for emergency purposes. After finishing her shift at the funeral home, Rachel returned home to get ready for her birthday party. There were about 8 people at Jonathan and Tina's house for Rachel's party, including Rachel, her brother John, Jonathan and Tina. Throughout the night, everyone hung out, relaxed, and enjoyed themselves. They smoked a little weed, drank a little alcohol, and just celebrated Rachel's 24th birthday. Later in the night, a few of them, including Rachel, John, and Tina, left the party to go to a nearby club to dance, drink, and hang out a little more, while the rest of the guests remained behind. That night, after returning from the club, Rachel and her brother decided to crash at Jonathan and Tina's house. The next morning, on January 28th, Rachel's birthday, she and her brother drove back to her apartment after leaving Jonathan and Tina's. Her brother didn't want to leave right away. He needed to decompress after everything they did the night before. So, he hung out at her apartment for about an hour before hitting the road to drive back to Warren. Remember, it's a 3-hour drive. When he got home, while changing and settling in, he realized he forgot to give Rachel her key. He immediately called her to let her know. This call was made at 1:58 p.m. Just a minute later, after talking to her brother, Rachel texted Jonathan to arrange to pick up her spare key later in the day from Tina and him. Jonathan and Tina had to drive one of the party guests who attended Rachel's party the night before back to their house in Athens, Ohio. But they told Rachel she could stop by when they returned home and said they'd let her know when they got back. After she got off work, Rachel texted Jonathan at 6:17 p.m. let him know she was done with work. He said, "Come on over." She told him, "Okay, I'll be there in about 20 minutes." Rachel arrived at Jonathan and Tina's around 6:30 p.m. She stayed for about 10 minutes, said goodbye and thank you, and left to go back to her place. On the way home, Rachel called her mom, and they talked on her way back. The call lasted about 10 minutes. The following day, Monday, January 29th, Rachel didn't show up to work at the funeral home. This was highly unusual. Isn't that the way a lot of people in these stories find out that something is wrong? So many people work from home now. I feel like things have changed so much, even from just 2018. It would take longer to know if someone went missing or something wasn't right. Rachel was close to her boss and his family, so she wouldn't miss work without informing them. In this case, they knew something wasn't right. The funeral parlor manager sent another employee, Trent Snyder, to check on Rachel. This was around noon. Trent arrived at Rachel's apartment and knocked on the door for several minutes without getting a response. Trent walked around and found the apartment complex manager on site asking to go inside Rachel's apartment to check on her, but the complex manager refused. At this point, Trent decided to call the police after he wasn't able to get anyone to assist him in checking on Rachel. As Trent spoke to the 911 dispatcher, he was looking through Rachel's living room window and saw a candle lit, sitting on her coffee table. That did not seem right, especially for someone like Rachel, who was very responsible. Then Trent looked out into the parking lot and saw Rachel's car was not in her usual parking spot. Instead, it was parked around the corner from her unit, rather than in front of it. He gave all this information to the dispatcher. After some time, the apartment manager came back to speak with Trent and said there was another person listed on the lease, and that person would need to give permission to enter. When Trent asked who, the manager explained it was a guy named Sean Riggs. Trent was not aware that anyone else lived with Rachel, but he had no choice but to wait. The complex manager got hold of Sean, who was actually Rachel's former roommate and ex-boyfriend. Even though Sean no longer lived with Rachel, he still had a key to her apartment and was still on the lease. Sean gave the property manager permission to enter Rachel's apartment, and she did. Upon opening the door, she briefly inspected it. Nothing seemed out of place. There were no signs of a struggle, and nothing worried her. No broken glass or overturned furniture. She just walked around, peeked into different areas, blew out the candle, and left to meet with the police and Trent outside. She told them that nothing appeared to have happened or seemed out of place. So all three of them left because there was nothing else they felt they could do at the moment. At this point, Rachel's boss, Jonathan, was made aware that Rachel did not show up for work. He tried calling her phone several times and did not get an answer. He was also informed that the property manager had spoken to Sean, so he called Sean, but Sean said he had no information for him. At this point, Jonathan was very concerned. He got in his car and drove over to Rachel's apartment. He banged on the door and got no answer. He tried to open both her front and back doors, but they were both locked and he couldn't get in. So he walked around and peered into her windows. He grew more concerned as every minute passed. It worried Jonathan that Rachel's car wasn't where it should have been. She would not have parked it in someone else's spot. She had a designated spot in front of her unit. After several unsuccessful attempts to contact Rachel by phone again, Jonathan happened to see a police car. He flagged it down, explained the situation, and requested a welfare check on his friend. Every time I read something like this, I always think, I hope I'm never in this position where I have to ask for a welfare check on my friend. But at least Rachel had friends like this who cared. The property manager returned and opened Rachel's apartment door again, this time in front of the police and Jonathan. Jonathan walked right in and went up to the second floor while the manager and the officer remained in Rachel's living room. Suddenly, while Jonathan was upstairs, a blood-curdling scream rang out. Jonathan rushed down the stairs and out the door, screaming to the police that Rachel was lying lifeless in her bedroom closet. The officer on the scene, Frank Sclafani, immediately radioed for backup while tending to Jonathan, who was pale and utterly freaked out. Of course, he had just found his best friend, seemingly deceased. Officer Sclafani went back inside Rachel's apartment and made his way upstairs. The bedroom closet was already open, and he peered inside. He could clearly see Rachel wrapped up in what looked like a comforter. He could also tell she had been gagged with something. There was a garment over her head and another around her neck, tied to the doorknob of the closet. When Columbus police detectives arrived, they called the Ohio Bureau of Criminal Investigation, BCI, for assistance. A BCI investigator, Agent Joshua Durst, searched the apartment and found no signs of forced entry on either the front or back doors. There seemed to be no evidence of a struggle on the first floor, no blood was found, and nothing looked out of place. Upon closer inspection, he located Rachel's purse on the floor in the living room, and it appeared to have been rummaged through and dumped out. Her driver's license and a receipt from Arby's were among the items on the floor. When Agent Durst looked at the receipt, he noted the date, January 28th. The time was 7:32, but he couldn't tell if it was AM or PM because the ink was dull in that area. Durst also noticed remnants of food from Arby's in the living room, a French fry box, an Arby's drink cup, and an open used ketchup packet. Here are the items he asked the CSI team to collect: a cell phone, a laptop computer, a water bottle, a Pepsi can, a few cigarette and cigar butts, and a glass smoking pipe. They were all bagged as evidence. The team did not find any cash, and no credit or debit cards were in Rachel's purse or anywhere in the home, which seemed odd. This could have been some kind of robbery, but the person didn't break in. Maybe they followed her in, or maybe someone staged it to look like a robbery when it wasn't. They weren't sure, and they needed more information. And they were about to get it in Rachel's bedroom. Agent Durst found Rachel lying next to a pillow in the upstairs bedroom closet, where Jonathan had told the officer he found her, and where Officer Frank Sclafani informed Durst he confirmed by peering inside himself. Durst noted that there was a very large saturated portion of the floor near the foot of Rachel's bed. There was a clothing iron, like a steam iron, with its cord cut and knotted up. When he looked closer, there appeared to be hair attached to it, as well as what looked like blood around the doorknob. On the outside portion of the closet was another knotted-up cord. This one belonged to a heating blanket. A pair of black leggings were also wrapped around this closet doorknob. As Agent Durst followed the cord, it stretched into the closet and then around Rachel's neck. It wasn't just draped around her neck, it was very tightly wound and then knotted. As Agent Durst pulled a thick, comforter-like blanket off Rachel, it exposed the rest of her body, and he could see that her wrists and ankles were bound together in a hogtie fashion with cords from her window blinds, her hair dryer, and curling iron. It's interesting that all these items came right from her room. It just seemed really personal. There was also a black t-shirt over her head, positioned like a hood. A black piece of material was sticking out of her mouth and had been stuck down her throat. Rachel was found only wearing a black tank top. She was not clothed from the waist down. As Durst kneeled down to let the CSI team move in and retrieve Rachel's body, a black pair of underwear was found underneath her. The cord and the items binding Rachel were removed, and that was when the sheer brutality of this crime was revealed. There was a deep stab wound to her neck and at the base of her skull. She was transported to the coroner's office for a full autopsy report. Meanwhile, investigators were diligently sweeping through Rachel's entire apartment, collecting potential evidence. BCI agents tested for fingerprints, took swabs of all the cords and various surfaces all over her apartment and her car, which we know was not in the right parking spot. The investigators were hoping to find what they call touch DNA, also referred to as trace DNA. It only requires a very small sample and usually consists of skin cells or even sweat left behind on an object when it's just casually touched. The dark stain at the foot of the bed was also swabbed to test for blood. It was big enough to assume that it was blood, and it was leading from the foot of the bed into the closet. Rachel's body was also swabbed, and in doing so, it was obvious that male DNA in the form of seminal fluid was present inside of her, as well as on the outside of her pelvic region and on her inner thighs. It was also indicated by injury to that area that Rachel suffered forced intercourse and struggled for a prolonged period of time. Her scalp had several lacerations and fractures, and the wound to her neck was so forceful that it broke off a piece of her skull. There were defensive wounds on her hands, and because Rachel's wrists and ankles were red, the medical examiner believed that she was alive when she was bound, probably so she would stop fighting. There were hemorrhages on her eyelids where the vessels in her eyes had become so overfilled that they basically broke due to the circulation being cut off. The autopsy report also determined that Rachel's cause of death was either the wound to her head or ligature strangulation. Either one of them could have been a direct cause. When investigators noticed Rachel's debit card was missing, they immediately contacted her bank and identified all the places where her card was accessed after Saturday. Rachel's bank records indicated her car was used at a food mart that was about a mile away from her apartment on January 28, 2018 at 9:43 p.m. In surveillance videos of the grocery store, Rachel's car is seen pulling into that parking lot. Afterward, a man gets out of Rachel's car from the passenger side, enters the store, uses the ATM, and returns. Investigators could see a hand on the driver's side of the car, but the person on the driver's side never got out. Video footage from that evening shows Rachel's debit card being used several more times, and the same pattern continued. A man would get out of the passenger side, use the ATM, or make a purchase, and then return to the car and drive away. So it was time for investigators to start interviewing people close to Rachel, starting with Rachel's brother. Obviously, being her brother, he was very close to her. They wanted to gather some information and see if he could point them in the direction of possible suspects. Considering he wasn't in town at the time of her murder and was back home in Warren, he was not initially a suspect of any kind. They were interviewing him to gather more information about Rachel, and even though it was very tough for John to speak to investigators, he knew how important it was to provide them with any possible information that he could think of. The first name that came out of his mouth was Jonathan Kennedy. Now, I don't like to jump to conclusions, but when I'm reading about these cases and doing my initial research, there are things that jump out at me. One of those things that I thought was just a little bit odd was how close Rachel seemed to be to another woman's husband. I understand they were friends from high school, and that Rachel was really good friends with Jonathan's sister growing up, but the fact that they were so close, and she was the one who would call him asking to coordinate, getting the key and things like that. He was also a contact that her boss knew about. Seemed like they were more than friends. However, I felt like my assumption was correct when I heard this interview with Rachel's brother. Guess what? He tells investigators that he had a really unusual conversation with his sister Rachel 2 weeks before her birthday party. Rachel ends up telling her brother that she and Jonathan had been hanging out with some friends and they did some acid. They were tripping. During the night, she told her brother that Jonathan kind of had this falling out while they were high. Why? She started feeling like he was coming on to her. In her words, she told her brother he was giving her sexual vibes. Later in the night, she tells her brother that Jonathan ended up insulting her by calling her a virus. Rachel definitely felt uncomfortable and told John that she was afraid of Jonathan. So, while Rachel's brother is explaining all this, he's also explaining to everyone that there was a birthday party at Jonathan and Tina's house. Of course, investigators are like, wait a minute, you just told us that 2 weeks before this party your sister said she was afraid of Jonathan. Why then are they hanging out again? That was actually something John was a little confused about himself. He said that Rachel just acted like nothing happened after that conversation, and she never mentioned having any concerns about Jonathan ever again. At the party, everything seemed completely fine. Everyone was friendly, and it seemed like they were all just good friends as they'd always been. Detective Hughes was interviewing John and asked if it was okay if they got a swab of his DNA. Of course, he wanted to help in any way he could, so he said yes, and they got a swab. They asked him if there was anyone else that they should look into, and John said, yeah, you should also look into Sean Griggs. He explained that Sean was Rachel's ex-boyfriend, still had a key to her place and was on the lease. But then there was this other person that John told the police about. However, he didn't have a name. He said that Rachel complained about a guy in the apartment complex who just seemed off to her. So now Detective Hughes has to go out and interview Jonathan Sean and find out who this mystery man is in the apartment complex that Rachel could have complained about. Well, Jonathan is interviewed. He's a mess. He says he has nothing to do with Rachel's murder. She was a very close friend of his since high school. He's married to Tina, but there's nothing going on between him and Rachel. He says he was with Tina the evening that Rachel was murdered, so his wife is his alibi. We've heard that so many times, not the best alibi, but an alibi nevertheless. And I like to give you as much information as possible. As far as Rachel's ex-boyfriend Sean and the unknown man at the apartment complex, both of those men were ruled out right away because neither one of them was in town at the time that Rachel was determined to have been murdered. However, the investigation kind of went in a totally different direction before they could even dive into Jonathan. The fact that Rachel's debit cards were missing was a huge clue. As I told you, her not having any cash or cards anywhere around her house definitely raised a red flag for investigators. The first thing Detective Hughes did when he found this information out was contact Rachel's bank. That's why they were able to pinpoint all the locations where her debit card had been used. They went to those locations and were able to get the surveillance footage. The first place that they indicated her card had been used was, as I had told you, a mile or two from her apartment. It was on January 28th at 9:43 p.m. Now remember the Arby's receipts that Agent Durst found on the floor, and he didn't know whether they were from 7 a.m. or p.m. Well, the fact that there were French fries, a French fry box, seemed like this would be p.m. So the fact that her card was being used just a couple of hours later at 9:43 pp. Gives them a bit of a timeline. 2 hours later, it was being used at the Food Mart on East Main Street. Now, the thing is, her card was also used at the ATM inside the Food Mart and several other ATMs that evening. Different ATMs at different places, different stores. On the afternoon of Monday, January 29th, her debit card was used on the north side of Columbus at Fair Food Mart on Cleveland Avenue. The same day, a few miles north on Cleveland Avenue, it was used at City Trends and at DSW Shoe Store. It was also used at a Kroger and at Hollywood Casino. Rachel's debit card was used 2 more days, Tuesday, January 30th, and Thursday, February 1st. Since Rachel was deceased, it's clearly not her making these purchases, so they have a lot of different places to gather surveillance from. The first one I really want to look at is the Food Mart. This was a transaction at 9:43 p.m., and this was the video that had the passenger getting out, going to the ATM, and going back to the passenger side of the vehicle. This is also the video where they see a person's hand on the driver's side of the car, but that person never gets out. So who is driving this vehicle? They go inside and start to interview the store clerk who was there when this transaction was happening. They show the clerk the video camera footage, and he says, "I know who's getting out of the passenger side. His name is Anthony Sleets." The clerk explains that he sees this man, Anthony, around all the time panhandling in the area and believes that he doesn't have a home and sleeps in the store parking lot. So this is going to be hard for detectives because they have a person without a residence. They sort of just have to wait around and see if he comes back. That's exactly what they're going to do. They also tell the store clerk, "If you see this Anthony Sleets person, notify us immediately." Sure enough, on February 6th, 2018, Detective Hughes gets a call from the store clerk. He says, "Anthony's in front of the Food Mart." So patrol officers go out and find Anthony Sleets in front of that store. They bring him in for questioning. Now wait until you hear what this man tells investigators. I could not believe it. I didn't know if it was a lie or if it was the truth, because it sounded really unusual, almost like it was rehearsed. He says that on the night of Sunday, January 28th, he was outside on Main Street when a man came out of the Food Mart and called out to him. He said he'd never seen this guy before. He was just a stranger. He told him he was probably in his 30s, possibly early 40s, 5 feet 7 inches, dark skin, kind of slanted eyes, sort of chubby cheeks, short hair, a stocky frame, and had a little bit of a southern accent. He said the guy was in a small, green 4-door car, kind of like a station wagon. The man told Anthony that he had just gotten into a fight with his girlfriend and that the girlfriend had been trying to steal his money, so he needed help getting money from her debit card. He said, "Listen, it's my girlfriend's card. I know the PIN. I just don't want to be the one to do it. Can you give me some help? In exchange, I'll give you a hotel room for the night." Of course, Anthony, being someone without a home, found this really enticing and agreed. All he had to do was enter the correct PIN number and get the money out of the ATM. He tells investigators that he attempted to get $2,000 from an ATM using Rachel's debit card, but he could only get $40. Anthony Sleets tells investigators that the guy said, "Okay, let's try it at some other locations." So they went to another food mart. Still, they were only able to get a little bit of money out. This continued until they got around $400 and some cigarettes and other miscellaneous items with Rachel's debit card. And guess what? This Sleets guy says that the man never gave him a hotel room. He literally just dropped him back off at the exact same place he picked him up. Police asked, "Are you sure about that? Are you sure you didn't go anywhere else? Are you sure you didn't go to a woman's apartment?" And he's like, "No, I didn't go anywhere else." He agrees to submit a DNA sample, which they do collect. So Detective Hughes has a lot of information. He's got a pretty good description that detectives can use and run against other suspects or potential people in mind. But they also continue to look at the locations where the card had been used. One of the videos shows a man trying to conceal his face while using the debit card at an ATM. But when they look at some additional footage from other locations, they realize that there's a woman coming out of the car, and sometimes it's just a woman using the card with no man in sight. I don't know about you, but I just kept going back to Jonathan and Tina. Investigators are diving into this, and they finally get a lead, a name, Deborah Pardon. Someone identified her as the woman who was seen entering those stores and using Rachel's debit card. But who is Deborah Pardon? Detective Hughes tracks Deborah down. It turns out she lives in a place called Linden, only 15 minutes away from Rachel's apartment complex. So they pay her a visit. Investigators tell her they're investigating the murder of Rachel Anderson, and Deborah is caught off guard. She has no idea what's going on. She says she does not know who Rachel is. They show her a picture, and she doesn't recognize Rachel at all. But then they start asking whether she knows anything about a debit card. And that's when Deborah gives them information about the fact that she had been using a debit card that didn't belong to her. They asked her where, and she says City Trends, Kroger, and the casino. That's when they showed her a snapshot of the surveillance video and said, "Is that you?" She admitted it was. So of course they're like, "Deborah, you have Rachel Anderson's card. Why are you in possession of a card from a woman who was murdered?" And that's when she's like, "Wait a minute. I was given this card by my brother." Again, they're pressing her. This is a murder investigation. They ask, "Okay, and your brother's name is Rachel Anderson?" She says no. So they ask, "What gave you the right or thought that this was okay?" She explains, "My brother dates a woman named Bernita Anderson. I saw the name Anderson and assumed it was somehow related to his girlfriend. Plus he knew the PIN number. I assumed he was allowed to use the card." So they're like, "Okay, here's the deal. You're going to either tell us everything right now, or we're going to charge you with credit card fraud." It turns out Deborah has a lengthy criminal record and doesn't want to get into more trouble, so she tells detectives everything she knows, or I should say, everyone she knows. She says, "Listen, my brother comes and stays with me every now and then, and sometimes I let him drive my green Ford or Hyundai Accent. But he also stays at his girlfriend's house, the one I mentioned, Bernita Anderson. They have a back and forth relationship. Sometimes they're on good terms, sometimes they are not." Then she says she's still in possession of some of the items she bought with Rachel's debit card. Officers were able to recover clothing with tags on them from City Trends and find casino receipts. The next thing they want to know is who Bernita Anderson is. It turns out, and I couldn't believe this, but it's true, Bernita Anderson lives in the exact same apartment complex on the exact same street as Rachel Anderson. Not only that, the back door of Rachel's apartment can be seen from the back door of Bernita's apartment. But more importantly, who is Deborah Pardon's brother? She finally gives them a name, Anthony Pardon. Now I understand there are two Johns essentially. There's John, Rachel's brother, and Jonathan, Rachel's friend. And now there are two Anthonys. There's Anthony Sleets, who we talked about, who doesn't have a home and was approached by a man at the food mart saying that his girlfriend had gotten into a fight with him. And then there's Anthony Pardon, who is allegedly the man seen driving the car on the surveillance camera and supposedly the person who approached Anthony Sleets at the food mart. So now they need to contact two people, Bernita and this Anthony Pardon person, and they need to do it fast. Meanwhile, while cleaning out Rachel's apartment, her poor mom ends up stumbling upon what is believed and later determined to be the murder weapon. She opened up a shoebox and found a 9-inch knife. There was blood and hair on it, and it matched the set in Rachel's kitchen. It was tested and came back positive for Rachel's DNA. We're now in the first week of February. They run Anthony Pardon's name in the system, and it turns out, just like his sister, he has a lengthy criminal record. I'm talking several times where he's forced intercourse on a woman, and I don't even want to go into the other people because of their age. Let's just say lower than double digits. It's absolutely disgusting. It's not something I will discuss, along with things like robbery and attempted murder. At the time that Rachel was murdered, this man had spent a total of 33 years in prison for his crimes, and he was a registered offender, a Tier 3. As detectives were going through Anthony Pardon's criminal history, they traced it all the way back to March 1979 when he was only 14 years old. He was made a ward of the courts and committed to Franklin County Children's Services. Unfortunately, he was placed in foster care, and life was not easy for Anthony. But it was what happened in 1980 that I won't talk about because it has to do with someone under the age of 1. This was the son of the foster parents who were taking care of this boy. He was 15 when he committed this crime. He was babysitting while his foster mom went out to the grocery store. And you know what he did? He told the police, and this is going to give you an idea of the mind of this person. He told them he did what he did because he got into a fight with his girlfriend and was upset. This time he was convicted of the crime as a juvenile. A year later, at 16, he was out and about already. He was inside his girlfriend's house to use her phone, and you know what he did? He did something to his girlfriend's mother. She was 39 at the time. He pulled out a knife, forced himself on her, and then stole $100 from her purse. He bound her feet and hands, gagged her, and put her in the trunk of her own car. He then drove her to a creek and threw her in it. When he looked back, he realized that she wasn't going under. Even with the way he tied her, she was floating, so he went and physically held her head under. The only reason this woman survived is that a stranger, a good Samaritan, came by, and Anthony got scared and ran off. He ran right to the store to buy shoes and a jogging outfit before he was apprehended by police. This time he was tried as an adult, but only a year later at 17, he was convicted of robbery and attempted murder. That's when he was sentenced to 25 years in prison. He was at the Southern Ohio Correctional Facility, and while he was there, he had several disciplinary infractions: possessing weapons, setting fire to mattresses, and fighting with other inmates. Ultimately, he spent more than 24 years in prison for that crime and was released in November 2006. That's when he moved to Georgia and got a job under a fake name. Why? Because he was trying to circumvent the system. He didn't want to register for his offenses so that the people in the community could know who they were living near. What kind of person is living among them? Well, he got in trouble for that. He got in trouble for forgery and failure to register, and he was convicted in Floyd County, Georgia. He spent another 9 years in prison. Why are they letting this guy out? When they did let him out, the judge gave him 20 years of probation. He was required to wear an ankle monitor. But in 2017, a year before Rachel was murdered, this man was released from prison. So he was out of prison and had the opportunity to commit this crime. He returned to Ohio in June, and at that time he did have to check in with the sheriff's department every 90 days as part of his parole. But you know what? Remember when the judge back in Georgia said he needed an ankle monitor and 20 years of probation? Well, Ohio never gave him one. They said it was an expense issue because he had to be monitored as long as that sentence said. On August 21, 2017, just a few months before Rachel's murder, he was caught in his car doing an indecent act. They asked him, "Who is this woman? Is she a professional? "What's going on?" He said, "No, it's just a friend. I'm just giving her a ride home." But later the woman contacted the police and said, no, he was paying me. Well, nothing ever came of that. Again, at 4 a.m. on January 27th, 2018, I'm literally talking about the morning before the crime happened at Rachel's. He was caught by police for driving without a license during a traffic stop. He had a pocket knife, a kitchen knife, and a pellet gun on him. You would think that he would be arrested, especially with his record, but he wasn't. These are the kinds of cases that bother me so badly because I'm sitting here thinking, this could have been avoided. At this point, police are like, this has to be our guy. Everything adds up. The location of his girlfriend's apartment, the fact that her back door and Rachel's back door are facing each other, and the fact that he was in possession of her debit cards. But you know how the law is, it doesn't matter what it looks like, you have to prove it. Well, that wasn't going to be hard because they had his DNA on file from previous crimes. They ran his DNA against what they collected on Rachel's body, as well as from the cords at the crime scene and other areas. It was a match, so police were at Deborah's house, waiting for Anthony to come out. As he was leaving and getting into his car, they arrested him. The car he was getting into was searched, and they found a baseball hat and gloves that were consistent with the hat and gloves worn by the man in their surveillance videos. They also found clothing with tags on it, a cell phone, a knife, and an air pistol, which they did not classify as a firearm because, technically, even though it looks like one, it's not. The first thing they did was get a hold of the phone records. The BCI and forensic team were able to pinpoint where his cell phone was pinging off of the evening of Sunday, January 28th. The phone was located in the area near Rachel's apartment and at all the locations where her debit cards were used. On Sunday, January 28th, Anthony Pardon's cell phone was pinging off of the cell tower closest to Rachel's house. But you know, his girlfriend lives there as well, so was he at Rachel's or was he just where he calls home, at Bernina Anderson's house? Well, between 7:59 p.m. and 9:25 p.m., not only did the cell tower pick him up, but Wi-Fi and GPS put Anthony near Rachel's apartment. So they really felt like they had it all. Then, the cell phone records showed an outgoing phone call on Monday, January 29th, in the same place where the clothes were bought at City Trends and DSW. On Tuesday, January 30th, his cell phone was associated with the cell tower near the Fair Food Mart and his sister's house. On Thursday, February 1st, his phone was associated with a tower near Rachel's apartment in the morning, and later pinged off of a tower near the East Side Market, where Rachel's debit card was used again. But of course, they always have to showcase the fact that they didn't know who was in possession of the cell phone. You never know, right? His cell phone was there, but was Anthony there? However, the most damning evidence was the forensic evidence. The DNA from Rachel's body and the cords that were used to constrain her. The DNA was from a single source, which was consistent with Anthony Pardon's DNA. DNA is interesting. I'm learning more and more about it. When they say it was consistent, it means it could be from a group of people, like Anthony Pardon himself with the Y chromosome. It could be a brother, his father, or his paternal grandfather. But what it also says is that it doesn't extend to a group of random men. So, if it wasn't Anthony Pardon, it would have had to be, like I said, his brother, father, or grandpa. None of those people were likely to be the person who did this to Rachel. Interestingly, the swab of Rachel's inner thigh and pelvic area brought back 2 male DNA profiles, but Anthony could not be excluded as the major contributor. Rachel's right wrist was swabbed, and there were 3 DNA profiles taken, but again, Anthony Pardon could not be excluded. For good measure, the curling iron cord, when tested, was also a mixture of 3 individuals, but at least 20.5 billion times more likely to be Rachel and Anthony than Rachel and some unknown person. The hairdryer had the same thing, 14.5 billion times more likely to have originated from Rachel and Anthony than Rachel and an unknown individual. DNA can be very confusing when presented like this because it makes you think, wait a minute, who's the other person? I always think, okay, the defense is going to jump on that so fast. Just to let you know, Anthony Slate had nothing to do with this. His DNA was never found on any of the swabs. Jonathan's DNA was found on a Pepsi can and the pipe that was taken from the apartment, but wasn't found on any of the items used to restrain Rachel. Her brother's DNA was found on a bathrobe in the upstairs bathroom, but on nothing else. Interestingly, her car did not have any evidence of Anthony Pardon's DNA. So Anthony was arrested, as I said, on February 9th, 2018, in the Linden neighborhood by the SWAT team, and his bail was set at $5 million. Of course, he did not go anywhere. He was in there. He was indicted on February 15th by a grand jury on 9 counts, including aggravated burglary, aggravated robbery, forcible intercourse, and aggravated murder, just to name a few. Because he was a repeat offender and a registered offender, the death penalty was on the table. He pleaded not guilty on February 20th to all charges. While he was awaiting his trial, which was set for February 4th, 2020, in December 2019, he sent a handwritten letter to a news station claiming he didn't kill Rachel. He said he didn't kill anyone and that this case was only because of his past. He claimed he knew Rachel because they used to do drugs together, but investigators found no connection between Rachel and Anthony. In their point of view, these letters and other shenanigans, like him not wanting to go to his pretrial hearing and literally locking himself in a cell, holding on to the walls, were because he wanted to delay his trial. He was desperate not to have to pay for what he did. Then, on January 24th, 2020, right before he was supposed to go to trial, he did it again. He dismissed his attorneys, saying he wanted to represent himself. But by January 27th, just a few days later, after being asked a bunch of questions by the judge, he said, "Never mind, I don't want to represent myself." Finally, on January 27th, they started jury selection, and his trial began on February 4th, 2020. Some of the first people to testify were Rachel's friend, Jonathan Kennedy. After all, he was the one who discovered her body, and he gave a heartfelt and very sad recollection of what it was like finding his very good friend the way that he did. Everyone I already talked about was also at the trial. They heard from the officers, the agents, and all of Rachel's co-workers. Closing arguments were held on February 12th, and there was a timeline constructed. The prosecutor explained that after Anthony trespassed into Rachel's home, her place of safety, her place where she sleeps, where she eats, where she comes home to relax, he took her life. This is what they said happened. At some point, when Rachel was at Jonathan and Tina's getting her key, her door was unable to be locked. Remember, that is when Anthony entered Rachel's apartment. We know she talked to her mom around 6:30, and the receipt from Arby's showed that she was there around 7:34. So before 8 o'clock, Anthony was already in her apartment. She was in her living room eating. And it's unclear how long Anthony watched Rachel before he grabbed her, took her from the downstairs to the upstairs portion of the apartment, and tied her up. Then he forced her to tell him her debit card PIN. He proceeded to do everything else he did, including the blunt force trauma, the wounds, the asphyxiation, and placing her in her own bedroom closet, leaving her there. They also determined that he did take her car and her credit cards and debit cards, then proceeded to go to the bank, do all that shopping, put her car back in the parking lot, and go to his girlfriend's house. The defense came up with a story about how, yes, Anthony used Rachel's cards, but he didn't kill her. They claimed it was all speculation, and the DNA and cell phone evidence were not conclusive to prove Anthony's guilt. They also suggested that Jonathan Kennedy was involved, and it's true they did find a combination of DNA on some of the items, which is interesting to me. But in the prosecution's rebuttal, they argued that the defense was willing to admit the geolocation evidence showing that Anthony used the stolen cards, but they wanted to disregard that same evidence about where he was on the night of the murder. You can't have it both ways. The jury consisted of 4 men and 8 women. They deliberated for approximately 6 hours over a 2-day period and found Anthony guilty of all charges. He was eligible for the death penalty, and that sentencing phase began on February 18th. This is when the defense attorney tried to bring up all of Anthony's past and blame everything on his chaotic childhood, that he was in foster care, and it was his upbringing. They tried to blame this for why he was so dysfunctional and why he got into so much trouble. But the prosecution said everything this man did outweighed all of the things the defense was bringing up. He was 53 years old. The defense explained that Anthony was one of 6 siblings. He grew up in a rough environment. Anthony's mother forced him and his siblings to steal debit cards as children and taught them how to use them. His family never stayed in one place for very long. Whenever young Anthony got comfortable in a new neighborhood, they had to move again. As a child, Anthony witnessed and experienced his father's forceful behavior. His father beat him with golf clubs and pool cues, once breaking a stick over his back. Anthony struggled with behavioral issues, and things were not good for him at school. His 3rd grade teacher and the principal tried to brainstorm ways to help him. An idea formed. A kindergarten teacher at the school allowed Anthony to become her little assistant. She gave him responsibilities like reading time and handing out supplies, and she said that Anthony was thriving under the teacher's trust and guidance. There was a notably positive change in Anthony's behavior. He started to show compassion and kindness to children. But sadly, this arrangement only lasted a couple of weeks because Anthony's mother was in prison at the time, and he was living with his grandparents. The problem was that the state wanted to reunite him with his biological parents. As a result, Anthony and his siblings were returned to his mother's care when she was released from prison. She took the family and forced them to move and change schools, and things only got worse. The defense went on to say that yes, he did go to prison, but he suffered physical altercations, and men forced themselves on him at the Southern Ohio Correctional Facility, which he called the worst prison in Ohio. This was the prison where there was an 11-day standoff between rioters and law enforcement back in April of 1993. The riot resulted in the deaths of correction officers and 9 inmates. This incident was one of the worst and most significant cases in prison history. The defense tried to bring all of this information, including a 9-hour interview between Anthony and a forensic investigator. During those 9 hours, the forensic psychologist attempted to understand Anthony's character. The psychologist received a 3,000-page document detailing Anthony's life just days before he was scheduled to testify. He didn't have enough time to review it thoroughly. He just said the system failed him, his mother failed him, the school system failed him, and the legal system failed him. According to the doctor, Anthony never received the treatment he should have received, especially after he was released from prison. Despite Anthony's supposed request for help, he never received it. Not having received the support he needed, Anthony developed a personality disorder. He only had a 3rd grade reading level as an adult, and the forensic psychologist even suggested that he might have brain damage. However, the prosecution reminded the jury that these horrible circumstances of Anthony's childhood do not excuse the seriousness of his heinous crime. At the sentencing hearing, Anthony spoke on his own behalf. He began by discussing his family. According to him, he came from a family where prison and drugs were common, and because of his background, he was unable to secure a job. Next, he blamed the prison system, saying, "The prison system failed me. Social services failed me. Everybody." As he spoke to the court, Anthony never mentioned Rachel. He said he just made bad choices throughout his life, and he ended his testimony by stating that he respected the decision of the court and only wanted them to know his story. Rachel's father also spoke at the sentencing hearing and mentioned how Anthony frequently complained about the system failing him. In Rachel's father's opinion, the system failed Rachel and her family by not keeping Anthony under lock and key and letting him roam the streets. A day before Anthony murdered his daughter, the police gave him a ride home instead of arresting him. After ruling against the death penalty, the judge sentenced Anthony to life in prison without the possibility of parole for Rachel's murder. He also sentenced him to life without parole for forcible intercourse and 33 years for all the other charges. All 3 sentences were to be served consecutively, ensuring that Anthony would never see the light of day again. The Rachel Anderson Memorial Scholarship was established by the Cincinnati College of Mortuary Science in honor of Rachel's passion for the funeral industry. Over $10,000 were raised for the scholarship by Rachel's family, friends, co-workers, and many others who were touched by her story. Approximately $2,500 has already been awarded as of 2019, and all remaining funds will be awarded twice a year. Rachel's scholarship will be granted to students at CCMS who have the same passion for funeral services that Rachel did, a woman who dedicated her life to those who had passed, taken from this world much too soon. Imagine living in a quiet rural town where the only crimes are the occasional petty break-ins. Then, the unimaginable happens. A family of 5 vanishes without a trace. A mother, a father, and 3 young children seem to disappear into thin air, leaving barely any clues behind. And when you finally discover the truth of what happened, it's more horrifying than you could have ever imagined. Now let's get into today's video. There's been something I have been a little bit insecure about. I get a little apprehensive about doing cases where I don't have a lot of photographs available of the victims or people involved. I personally love looking at photographs because they help me understand everything so much better, especially what the victims were like. However, they're not always available in every single case, and I do my very best. I wanted to let you know that for today's case, I have a very limited amount of those pictures. I have a lot more pictures of other important aspects of this case, but I do not want that to stop me from talking about a case that I'm interested in or that I really want to share. The family we're talking about belongs to a hard-working man named Ricky Bernieser, who was living in a very rural area out in Cushing, Wisconsin, just a few miles from the Minnesota border. Before I go into details about where Ricky was living when the events that I will be discussing occurred, I want to introduce you to him and tell you a little bit about his family and upbringing. Ricky Bruce Bernieser was born in Polk County, Wisconsin in 1956 to Virgil and Bernadine Bernieser. His parents owned and operated a mink ranch. If you don't know what that is, it's a ranch or a farm where they raise these cute little creatures that look a lot like weasels or ferrets, called minks. These little animals are bred for their fur, and according to furcommission.com, more than 85% of pelts used in the world's fur trade come from small family-run farms, just like the one that the Bernieser family owned. Wisconsin is the leading mink-producing state. Mink can be used for a lot of things. You probably see it on those furry little pom-poms people have on their purses, scarves, shoes, boots, and keychains. Furs can also be used to make clothing like coats and hats. Ricky wasn't the only child. He had 2 brothers, Wayne and Keith. His mother took pride in caring for her sons. She was a hard worker who not only helped out on the farm, but later worked as a housekeeper at hospitals, nursing homes, and motels throughout the 70s through the 90s in both Wisconsin and Minnesota. She also really enjoyed making rugs and quilts. Ricky's father, Virgil, loved farming, raising his minks, trapping, fishing, and hunting. These were activities he enjoyed with his boys. The family lived a simple life, valuing hard work and family. When Ricky was just a teen, he ended up meeting and marrying a woman named Alice. By the time he was just 20 years old, they welcomed a son into the world who took Ricky's middle name, Bruce. He was born on June 27, 1975. Ricky and Alice were a young couple, and unfortunately their marriage did not work out. Before Bruce was even 10 years old, the couple divorced. Alice remarried to a man named Ron Anderson who had a son only 2 years older than Bruce. It was like Bruce had a built-in big brother who he could look up to, learn from, and have a support system while going through the separation of his parents and living between 2 homes. Bruce needed a little bit of stability, which he found in Jesse Anderson, his new big brother. Ricky was also lucky enough to meet a very special woman named Ruth Ann around the same time. Ruth Ann had 2 daughters from a previous marriage, Mindy Lynn, who was only 2, and Heidi, who was 5. Now Bruce had 2 built-in little sisters as well. Let me introduce you to Ricky's new lady, Ruth Ann Berenson. She was born in Blue Earth, Minnesota on December 28, 1959, to Mary and Wilmer Luther Moranson. Ruth Ann was very close to her mom, who probably doted on her just a little more than the usual mom, due to the fact that Ruth Ann was blind in one eye. She really did have a lot of trouble focusing, which could make normal everyday activities harder for her. Nevertheless, Ruth Ann got by, and now she had Ricky to take care of her. But before they knew it, they were also taking care of someone else, because in 1986, when Ricky was 31 and Ruth Ann was only 28, they welcomed a little girl of their own into the world, Crystal Ann Bernieser. Ricky was a hard worker, just like his father. However, he had a lot less than his father did. This was not a wealthy family, but Ricky was doing the best that he knew how. He was working 3 part-time jobs to provide for his growing family. Most of his time was spent working for a turkey farmer, putting up fences. He was good at it and would provide these fencing services to other businesses as a freelancer. Ricky would also sell miscellaneous items at a local flea market on the weekends. This town was a very small rural town called Sterling Township. Another township, rocking up the townships on this channel in these stories, but it's not as small as last week's case. That one was a very small town called Maybe, Michigan. That one had a population of under 600. Today's case in Sterling has a population of about 724, but it's smaller in a way because they are more spread out. There's almost nothing out here. All I see are homes scattered far apart with a lot of foresty areas in between. And get this, Ricky and his family lived in an even more remote part of Sterling called the Barrens. It's actually a national park. It's very pretty, but as the name suggests, it's barren. It's located in pitted outwash deposits laid down by glacier-melted streams. Sterling Barrens has a lot of grass and a lot of dirt. This area also has wetlands and is known for their jack pine forests. For example, I looked at some real estate sites. This is what you're going to get if you live there. Land, debrayed, 2.5 acres, are going for $25,000. And then you can do what Ricky did. You put a mobile home on the land, so it would look something like this. Don't worry, I did find actual photos of Ricky's mobile home, and we will get to that a little later. But yes, this family of 5 was living in a pretty cramped living space, with Bruce going back and forth between his father's place and his mother Alice's place with his stepdad Ron, where his stepbrother lived. And that's Jesse. They lived about 20 minutes away in St. Croix Falls, so he got the best of both worlds. He got his boy time with his stepbrother in a more populated area, and he was big brother to his 3 sisters living the more simple rural life. When he was with Alice in St. Croix, he was in an area that I'm showing you on the map. Already you can see a lot more is going on there. They've got gyms, pizza places, breweries, and his high school. He was attending as a junior in 1991 at St. Croix Falls High School. As the other man of the house when he was at Ricky's, Bruce was independent. As a high schooler, he would get up, get to school on his own, then either come back home to do his homework until Ruth Ann or Ricky got back from working or getting the girls, or he was picked up by his mom on her days. Normal teenager responsibilities. I just set the stage for the time frame that we're looking at. It's 1991. Ricky's 35, his wife Ruth Ann is 31, Bruce is now 15, his stepbrother Jesse is 17, and the 3 girls, Heidi 10, Mindy 7, and Crystal 5. I truly hope I have done a decent job keeping all of the family members organized. Life for Ricky consisted of weekends at flea markets and work weeks gathering building materials and working at various fencing jobs around town and beyond, while Ruth Ann stayed home with the girls. The older 2 rode the bus to and from Cushing Elementary School, which was about a 30-minute drive. It is just dirt roads most of the way there. Bruce would also ride the bus to get to high school and then get rides home from Alice, Ron, or Jesse if he wasn't coming back to Sterling Township and the mobile home. Sometimes Ricky would have to work out of town for extended periods of time. When he did this, he wasn't really keen on Ruth Ann and the girls being left alone out in the middle of nowhere, so he would take them with him, and Bruce would go to Alice's. One of those jobs seemed to have come up in April. Ricky did a lot more fencing jobs during the spring and the summer, especially summer. That's when business was at the best point, so he would never pass up an offer because he really couldn't afford to. April 22nd, 1991 was a normal Monday. Mindy and Heidi went to school on the bus, attended class, then got on the bus again and came home after school. Bruce did the same at his school. However, it's what happened the next day that didn't make sense. An entire family was missing. Bruce's mom, Alice, gets a phone call from Bruce after school on Tuesday. He just got back to the mobile home and no one is there. He's 15. If Ricky plans to stay away for more than a few hours or a night at the most, he would have made arrangements to have Bruce go to Alice's. So what is going on? Was there a miscommunication, a mix-up of some kind? It happens. Bruce was left alone. Alice was not okay with Bruce being out in the middle of the woods by himself, so she tells him she's going to come pick him up and take him back to St. Croix until they know what's going on. They could figure it out. There were no cell phones back then. I'm sure Alice wasn't thrilled. Her 15-year-old left behind, no word from her ex-husband. She wondered what was going on. Alice wanted to know what Bruce had heard from his dad. What did he say last? Where was he going? What was the story? Bruce explained his dad told him he had a fencing job coming up, and he had to get building materials from a hardware store. And out there, it's a chain called Menards. It's like a Home Depot, and the closest one is actually an hour away in Minnesota. So, he would be back in a couple of hours or so, and he was taking Ruth Ann and the girls with him. Nothing out of the ordinary. Bruce saw them leave in one of Ricky's vehicles. The family had 3 cars, one they drove when it was all of them together going somewhere, or when Ricky needed to lug material around, and that was a green 1980 Oldsmobile station wagon. They also had a small red car and a Hyundai. After Ricky left in the station wagon with Ruth Ann and the girls, Bruce finished his homework and went to bed. The next morning, he got up, got ready for school, and got ready to get on the bus. He noticed that Ricky and the girls were not home. He figured at this point, he either misunderstood his dad. It can happen, you're 15. Sometimes I'm like, is it in one ear and out the other? He thinks, maybe I misheard my dad or Ricky made a mistake with the info that he relayed to Bruce. But that day, when his dad wasn't back, he called his mom. So that's where we are in the timeline. Bruce is now at Alice's house. She is trying to call the mobile home for the rest of that afternoon and night, and doesn't get an answer. Upon getting up the next morning, which is Wednesday, April 24th, Alice immediately started to call again. She's hoping that someone would pick up the phone in the Brunicer household. She knows her ex-husband wouldn't have just abandoned their son on purpose and not at least let her know what was going on. She knew it was time to alert someone, so she called the police. By this point, the family had been missing for 2 days. Alice notified the Polk County Sheriff's Office. They were not immediately concerned. Crimes were rare in Polk County. Out of the entire state, that county had the lowest crime rate. If a crime was committed in that area, it was something really simple, like a cabin break-in, nothing more. So, the sheriff's office assumed the missing family would eventually show up and tell everyone there had just been a big misunderstanding. However, since there are minors involved, the police do begin to check reliable sources to gather information, to see if anyone close to the family had been informed of their absence, also retracing their steps, trying to find out what they did before they left. Things that could establish somewhat of a timeline just in case they truly were missing. They definitely don't want to waste any time. So when they interview Ricky's friends and family, they all said the same thing, that he was hardworking, did fencing as a freelancer. Ricky's father said it's probably true. He most likely went on a fencing job because he would leave for those jobs, and they were out of the area, and he would bring his family with him. That was one of the possibilities in this case. Ricky's dad gives police information about where his son shops, what he does on a regular basis, and also provides information about the local flea market. Investigators go and talk to the owner of said flea market. They find out Ricky usually reserves these areas, sets up his shop there, and reserved a unit for April 27th, which was just a few days away. This was important because the owner said Ricky has never been a no-show. So this is something police can look forward to as a date to mark down. And if at that point the family isn't back, then there would be even more cause to be concerned. So that's definitely a lead in the case. At this point, it's not as though Ricky had a ton of friends. He was well known in the area, because there weren't a lot of people in the area, but there weren't that many people for police to interview. However, they were able to get in touch with a man named Jim Ewing. He was the owner of Cushing Corner Store, a gas station, and guess what he said? He said he saw Ricky. He said Ricky came by for gasoline for one of his cars. The police were like, okay, well, which day was it? And he's like, I think it was April 21st. But then he goes, wait, no, it could have been the 23rd. So now there's a bit of a discrepancy. It would make sense to police if it was April 21st. That would mean it was Sunday before the day he set out to get the building supplies and materials from Menards. He also said it could have been that Monday, the 22nd, which was the day they actually left. So both of those kind of make sense. But then he adds the 23rd, so that's the day after they left. This man is a little bit confused. There's no technology for him to go back and look at what day it was. His exact quote to police was, I feel like in my memory, Rick was here on Tuesday, April 23rd. But there's still doubt in the back of my mind. However, what he did recall all was that Ricky was there to buy gas for a small red car, not the green station wagon. This guy doesn't seem like he's the most reliable witness, so police aren't really getting any further in their preliminary information gathering. At this point, they do think it's important to talk to Bruce since he was the last person to see his family that we know of. So, investigators go down to the high school, and the 15-year-old is a typical 15-year-old. They ask him, what did your dad say? What's the story? And he said the same thing that he told his mom. My dad said he was going to be gone for a few hours. He needed to go to Minnesota Twin City area to Menards to get building supplies. He said he expected his dad to be home by that evening. As they are continuing to interview people, they find out that Ricky had done a few jobs for some people in the community the past week or so, and nothing was out of the ordinary. After they were done making their rounds, they pretty much verified all the information I've already given you. Everyone sort of said the same thing, where he usually goes, what he usually does. Nothing was out of the ordinary, but not letting anyone know where he was going was a little odd. But they figured, let's wait till the 27th, because remember, he's got the flea market unit reserved. He also had a $300 advance given to him from a farmer in the area for fencing work that was set to be done. So they still have a lot of hope that this family is going to come back, that they're not really missing. So they wait until the 27th. And you know, we wouldn't be talking about this case if they had shown up, but the fact is they never did. Ricky never made it to the flea market on the 27th. So now, this investigation has definitely shifted. They're taking it a lot more seriously. They have a family of 5 that has practically vanished into thin air. This is not normal. Now it's time for investigators to look into the mobile home and try to find out if there's anything missing, if there could be any clue to their whereabouts. So they go ahead and they do a search, and they find out that pretty much everything has been left behind. It doesn't seem like any of their young daughter's belongings have been taken, but they do notice Ruth Ann's purse is gone, and of course, the station wagon. Those were the only things they could confirm were missing. As time is passing, Bruce has become more and more concerned about what's happening with his family, especially his father. There has been more time for everyone to think and to talk about the different possibilities that could have happened. And Bruce tells investigators he remembers something that could be of significance. When Bruce was there with the police as they were going through the mobile home, they asked Bruce if he thought that anything looked out of the ordinary. He said, well, not necessarily. However, that's when Alice kind of piped up and was like, wait a minute. When Bruce called me and told me that his dad was gone, he said something. He said he could sense that someone had been in the trailer, like the feeling you get in your gut that someone's been there. And this is a real thing. People do have these gut feelings that their privacy has been invaded. Even though he didn't see anything missing, it seemed like things were maybe moved around, or items were misplaced, or almost as though someone had rummaged around looking for something. So they asked him, well, do you know anyone who would want to steal anything, hurt your family, or your dad's girlfriend? or kids? Do you know anyone that would want to do something like that?" And Bruce was like, "No." But he's thinking back, and the only thing that comes to mind is something that happened about a month earlier. And he says, "Well, I was home alone in the trailer. So someone knocked at the door. I opened it, and it was a man. He wanted to know where my dad was. So he tells the guy, who was a complete stranger to him, 'My dad's not home.'" Bruce is not quoting word for word, but he's basically telling the police that this guy kind of insinuated that Ricky owed him some money and that he was going to come back and collect it. Bruce, who was concerned, obviously, he tells his father this. His father's like, "Well, what did he say?" And he said he just laughed and told Bruce it wasn't even a big deal. Well, this does pique investigators' interest. They want to know what Ricky's lifestyle was like. I mean, I can clearly see he's not a man of many means. And they could see as well the living conditions inside the trailer were not the best. So as they're questioning Alice and other people close to Ricky, they do find out that the family was struggling financially. They were living in this double-wide trailer. He was working 3 jobs. And as they're digging more into his personal life, they do find out how protective he was over his girlfriend and his girls, and how it wasn't common for him to want to leave them there if he was going for an extended trip or even away for the night. We already know all this. Nevertheless, we don't know everything about Ricky. It's possible Ricky had borrowed money from the wrong person, and now they have sought revenge of some kind and taken him and his family when he can't pay the loan. It's possible. Anything is possible at this point. They can't rule it out. So the investigators' next step is Menards in Minnesota, where Ricky, Ruth Ann, Mindy, Heidi, and Crystal were supposed to be going. The investigators asked Menards to see the records from April 22nd so they could search to see if Ricky purchased any supplies that day. It's 1991. Pulling records from weeks ago would take a lot of work, but the store promised they would get back to investigators as soon as they could. And eventually, someone from Menards did contact the Polk County Sheriff's Office, and they said, "We don't have any credit card transactions or checks that were made by Ricky or Ruth Ann on April 22nd. And as a matter of fact, they don't have any in the past week or so. However, if they would have paid in cash, there would not be a record because they could have paid in cash. They know that Ricky just got a cash advance for a job that he's planning to have done, so it's not out of the realm of possibility that they did pay with cash. Anything is possible still. Or they could have gotten in a car accident. Maybe someone saw them paying in cash and thought, hey, they have some money. Maybe they robbed them. Maybe the family got hurt. Maybe they just got lost on their way to the job that he was supposed to be doing. But at this point, they're going into May. It's time for investigators to get out there and start combing the area all around Sterling Township. And it was very heavily wooded. They also want to route the road between Sterling Township and Menards to see if the car went off the side of the road, if anything suspicious can be found, if anyone along the way could have seen this family. You really can't miss a family of 5. They also entered the 1980 Oldsmobile station wagon into a database so that if any car is matching that description or pulled over, they would be searched. Investigators combed through the neighborhood, all the roads leading to different trails, pathways, driveways in the Sterling Township area, and the farmers combed their farms. There were people from the community out there looking. This was a big story in the area. It was the top of the news and the front page of the newspapers. Everyone was starting to become very concerned. Even the Associated Press had gotten word of it. So this is big news. How could a family just disappear and leave behind their 15-year-old son? It's terrifying. It doesn't happen. Nobody expects it to happen. And anyone with a family, which is basically everyone, every single one of us, we're relating to this, thinking, what if something were to happen to my family? So, everyone is spreading the word. They're talking about it. Wherever you go, you're hearing about this family that went missing. That's a good thing. Not that they went missing, but that people are spreading the word, because the more widespread the story is, the more likely investigators will get a lead in the case. They are about to, and it's not good news. Polk County Sheriff's Office gets a call from a trout fisherman. He's calling from Sterling Township. He was on his way back through a wooded area to a trout stream, and he came across a vehicle. And because of the widespread coverage of the story, this trout fisherman was able to determine that this station wagon matched the description of Ricky's vehicle. But the vehicle was burned. Investigators go out there, and immediately the first thing they notice is that this burned-out vehicle is only 3 miles away from Ricky's double-wide. All that was left was the frame of the station wagon. There are so many questions. Did the vehicle swerve off the road like many people thought? Did they get in an accident? Did the car blow up? But this was just unbelievable. But at the same time, this is their biggest lead now. They had something that they could actually investigate. But as they're doing a walk around of this vehicle, something stands out. There are no license plates on it. A couple of things are happening right now. One, they can't actually identify this car as belonging to Ricky. But it doesn't matter. The investigators didn't have to have a license plate to identify it. They knew that this was the station wagon. And it's not looking good, because the other thing it meant was that someone removed those license plates. Was it Ricky? Was he really in some kind of really bad financial situation, and he burned his vehicle for insurance purposes? That was highly unlikely. They knew that this car had been dumped there. And when I say dumped, what I mean is they found an unburned shovel inside the frame of the station wagon. And that is what led them to believe that someone had been there after the fire had stopped burning. Because this is such a heavily wooded area, the vehicle had not been found. Plus, they weren't looking for a burnt car frame. They were looking for a distinctive green station wagon in working condition. And at this point, this is a crime scene. So they got the tape going up, the teams are coming in, they're photographing everything. And you know, I'm going to tell you what they find. They find shoe prints on the back driver's side door. So not the driver's door, but the one behind it. This is a 4-door vehicle. The footprint was on the exterior, and they could ascertain that it was put there after the fire had stopped. After this car had been in an inferno, someone went up and they kicked that door, leaving a shoe print behind. Another thing they found was the back bumper had blood on it. Blood that survived this fire. All 4 of the tires were totally burned down to the pads. Nothing was left. Everything is gone. There's nothing inside, no upholsteries left over, all the plastics are burned, the dashboard, everything's gone. The thing is, when you're dealing with a fire, there is evidence to be found. Every single aspect of that vehicle, and how it burned and what's in the ashes, is going to paint its own picture of exactly what happened. Forensics is absolutely fascinating to me. There's always going to be a specialist in every single type of forensics. And not only that, the investigators suspected this was not just a fire, it was an arson. They found a gas can inside of the burned-out vehicle. They could also tell that someone drove the car with a key. This wasn't the case where somebody hot-wired the vehicle, took off the dashboard, something like that. But the most disturbing piece of evidence that the investigators discovered was in the back of the station wagon. That's where they found that shovel. And among all the ashes and the debris, they thought that they found what looked like bone fragments. These were just investigators that do crime scenes as a whole. These were not specialists. So now they know they need to call in an anthropologist. So they get an expert from the University of Wisconsin to help them collect these fragments, to find out if they're bone, and if they are they human in nature? An anthropologist came out, and not only were these bone fragments human, but this anthropologist was able to determine, with their specific professional expertise, that it was the bones of 2 adults and at least 2 juveniles. It is just devastating because these investigators, they don't even need to positively identify bodies as far as they're concerned, because everything is adding up. And when they're adding it all up, they're realizing that this is the family that they're looking for in 1991. It's not like the DNA top technology was at some point where it is now, where they can make these perfect conclusions. So instead, what they end up having to do is literally get on their hands and knees and sift through all of these fragments, every single particle that's in that charred vehicle, to find teeth, and as many teeth as they can find, because they need to use dental records to determine whose remains were located in that vehicle. At this point, they have also determined this is a homicide. This is not an accidental death. And one of the reasons why they determined that was because when they examined the entire vehicle, the front seat didn't have any human remains in it. All of the fragments were located in the back of the vehicle. So to them, this meant the driver had taken the bodies to that area and burned the vehicle to the ground with the bodies inside. There were so many questions at this point, but the homicide department has now taken over the case. This investigation is getting even more intense. There were 97 different dental fragments found in this vehicle, and sadly, the dental records did confirm that the remains of Ricky and Ruth Ann were located in that vehicle. However, because the children were so young, they didn't have a lot of dental work done, so they didn't have a lot of dental records. Examination of the fragments confirmed that the teeth belonged to different children. There were some pieces that matched a 5-year-old, and Crystal was 5, and other fragments that were consistent with children that were in the age range of 7 to 8 and 10 to 11, which approximately matched both Heidi and Mindy's ages. And the thing that I found equally fascinating and disturbing was that while these dental fragments were being examined, some of Ricky's had lead in them. So this meant that this lead actually came from a bullet and it had been lodged in that part of his teeth. Investigators knew this was most likely from a shot to the head. This is an absolutely horrific crime. Someone just eliminated an entire family, 3 of which were minors. The residents in Cushing are absolutely terrified. They are haunted by the fact that this family was not only killed, they were burned in their own vehicle just 3 miles away from their home, and their son, Bruce, is now left behind. The community is there. They're supporting this family as much as they possibly can. Social workers are coming out to assist Alice with Bruce, offering him counseling and a chance for Bruce to get any kind of assistance that he needed. They also needed him to be in a good state of mind, or the best state of mind that they could get him in, because they needed to ask him questions. He was the one that lived with his family. If they had any follow-up questions, they needed him to kind of be on his game. I mean, this poor kid was grieving, but at the same time, he's one of their most important components to this case, and they knew there was going to be a lot of questions. But of course, Alice was being very protective over her son, which is to be expected. However, they were willing to make time for police investigators anytime they needed to question Bruce. And they did. The only thing that stood out was that man that came looking for Ricky before his murder. So based on Bruce's story, the investigators concluded someone killed Ricky in revenge for some kind of outstanding debt. Just like many of the other cases, the media is going wild. More information is getting out to the community, and more tips are coming. And someone reported that there's graffiti, not just graffiti but satanic graffiti on this temple. This is about 10 miles away from Cushing, and the graffiti said, "Devil worship, death by fire," and then it was signed with the letters SITN. And because the family was burned, and a lot of satanic rituals include fires, there was this rumor, if you can call it that, or this idea that the graffiti on this temple was connected to these murders. Well, they can't just leave any stone unturned. They had to call in, I swear this is real, a satanic expert. I mean, like I said, there are experts in everything, and they were trying to identify what those strange letters were, and they couldn't figure it out. To me, I just thought it was like kind of an acronym for Satan, even though there's an I like SITN, Satan. I don't know. That's not my expertise. But in 1991, the Satanic Panic was at its height. Throughout the 1980s and the 1990s, there was widespread panic regarding satanic ritual-related crimes. Many of the over 12,000 claims of these types of crimes were supported and substantiated by Christian fundamentalists, social workers, law enforcement officers. Several cases of these alleged satanic crimes ended with actual convictions. For example, the alleged satanic rituals of the McMartin preschool trial, or the West Memphis 3. They became infamous, and they were widespread, bringing a lot of media attention. And so for the residents of Cushing, It wasn't hard for them to believe that a deranged, devil-worshipping stranger committed this crime because they didn't want to believe it was one of their own. They didn't want to believe it was someone that actually lived among them. It's got to be a devil worshipper. Investigators started questioning the residents about satanic cults, or if they knew people who were involved in worshiping the devil. Well, actually, they ended up interviewing some friends who go to school with Bruce. And these friends say they think that Bruce buys marijuana from some guy who has a satanic background. Now, you can't believe every single tip, but they, once again, had to look into it. They found out this wasn't warranted. They dropped it. The whole satanic investigation was over after this. There wasn't anything conclusive that linked ISM to what happened to this family. However, when they were interviewing these friends, they said maybe the marijuana dealer who is a Satanist was the one that came to the door and wanted money. It didn't go anywhere, but as they're interviewing these friends, they stumble upon someone who's very close to Bruce, and her name is Katie Han. She's a friend of Bruce's because she's dating Jesse, which is Bruce's stepbrother. Remember him? He's 17 years old at the time. They've grown up together, they're very close. Well, Katie is close to Jesse, and therefore, just by proximity, she's close to Bruce. So investigators are very interested in talking to her about the marijuana situation and other things like, what does she know about these boys? What does she know about Bruce? This was 6 days after that vehicle was found, and the investigators bring Katie in for questioning. She lets them know that even though they're not blood brothers, these brothers are very close. They're confidants, they're best friends. Bruce looks up to Jesse, and they really should be talking to Jesse because he knows everything about Bruce's life, everything about what goes on at Ricky's house. One thing she said is that both Jesse and Bruce seemed to be very concerned about everything that was going on, rightfully so. But not just that, they were kind of annoyed with the way that police were interviewing all their friends and their family members. She thought that it looked as though they were worried, but you know what? Everybody grieves in different ways. That's what they say. Nevertheless, they're going to have to interview Jesse anyway because now they're thinking, does Jesse have some kind of involvement in this? And if so, Katie says they have a strong bond. They don't do anything without letting the other one know. Investigators think now is a good time to question Jesse, so they arrange to meet with him and his father, Ron, at their home. When they asked Jesse, "What do you know?" he told them everything that Bruce had already told them, everything that we already know, saying that's what Bruce relayed to him. But the more the investigators kind of pressed Jesse, he gets upset, he's uncomfortable, and his dad is there, and they keep giving each other looks like, I don't really want to be here. It came off as kind of aggressive, defensive. He didn't want to answer certain things, and at one point Jesse's dad says, "You know what? We're going to go talk in another room out of the presence of the investigators for a moment." They were talking for 15 minutes. Ron Anderson comes back with his son, and he says, "You know what? We're going to need to consult with an attorney, which I don't actually think is a bad idea. Just so you know, this is a murder investigation. It's a big deal. This is a serious crime. Your minor child is being interviewed about said crime. So they say before making any further statements, we want to get an attorney." Is this suspicious? I don't know. I don't think we should think it is, but investigators think it is. Yes, they're always looking for holes in people's stories. And not only that, when they were interviewing another friend that knew Bruce, he said that Bruce was acting strange. Again, we know the whole people grieve in different ways, but they said that they saw Bruce selling some of the items that belonged to his family. Not necessarily suspicious because, this boy is not very well off. His dad even sold miscellaneous items at the flea market. However, they get information that Bruce was spending coins, and these coins weren't just, spare change like in the couch cushions. These were collectible. They were a collection of coins that his father considered his prized possessions. Apparently, Bruce had been at an arcade, and he was just using these coins like they were ordinary ones. Now, did a 15-year-old know the difference? I don't know, but is this strange? I kinda think it is, and investigators thought it was. It also turns out Bruce had been giving away his family's possessions. Now I know I have heard stories, don't know if you have, where people don't want to be surrounded by certain things because it brings back too many memories, so they decide to get rid of things. Everyone's different, but he's giving away TVs and stereos, and he makes a weird statement to one of his friends. He tells them, "I now have 3 cars of my own." And this was when his family members were just reported missing. He's saying this as though he knows that his dad's not coming back, that his family is not going to be using these cars. But is it true? They don't know. They need to find out more. This witness also said, if you want to know more, you need to ask who? Oh, Jesse Anderson. There's that name again, Bruce's stepbrother. So now we're circling back. We know that he wants to get an attorney. He's not going to be talking. But is it? Well, in that case, we did not know as much as we're going to find out in this case. You're going to find out details because someone knows what happened. This is the portion of the video where everything falls into place and comes together, and it's going to happen fast. Everything is coming to the surface. They want to set up another interview with Jesse and his attorney. They don't care that the attorney will be there, but before they can even do that, on May 18th, Jesse and his father let investigators know Jesse wants to cooperate. There's something that he wants to tell you. I have a lot of comments on this later, but let's just hear what Jesse has to say, and he's going to have a lot to say. He's like a diary of the mouth at this point. But the first thing that Jesse lets them know is that Bruce doesn't exactly get along with his father. Many teenage boys don't. Investigators had already been interviewing close friends and family, and yes, they'd heard about the normal father-son argument, strictness, so on and so forth. But Jesse takes it one step further. He says that Bruce hates having to go to his father's mobile home. He pretty much hates his father. Remember I told you that the trailer wasn't exactly in ship shape? Well, it's a mess. It's an absolute disaster, and Bruce was sick of it. It infuriated him to have to live in what he considered filth. It was a disgusting environment as far as he was concerned, and I admit I looked at it. There are things everywhere. You can see, you can't even see the floor. Here's the actual video from the trailer, so you can get an idea of what Bruce is talking about. Jesse also says that Ricky isn't the best father to Bruce. He treats Bruce differently than he treats the girls. It's kind of like Bruce is the outcast of the family. And not only that, Jesse said that Ruth Ann didn't like Bruce and wanted him out of the trailer. He said that the living conditions weren't just about being dirty and messy. There were times when Bruce didn't have electricity, no plumbing, no running water, and he would get into arguments with Ricky about this. Bruce said he was constantly being manipulated by Ricky, that he would make all these promises that he couldn't keep, and he was sick of it. In the mind of a 15-year-old, he was fed up. So he tells Jesse he wants to kill his father. When investigators asked Jesse, "Well, what did you think when Bruce was telling you all this?" Jesse says, "I thought he was joking." It wasn't the first time that Bruce had said things like that, and even laughed about things like that he hated his father, that he hated Ruth Ann, that he hated visiting his father and trying to sleep in this dumpy double-wide trailer with 3 screaming little girls. Not only that, Bruce had something else to say. He asked Jesse, "Do you have anything to help me carry out this crime?" Because Bruce had a rifle, but he needed ammunition, and guess what? Jesse gave it to him. And I'm sitting there thinking, you really didn't think he was serious, but you're giving this 15-year-old boy ammunition. Why would you do that? Well, investigators want to know, but then the attorney kind of stops him and says, "You know, Jesse has a lot more to say, but the thing is, he doesn't want to get in trouble because, this is a major case. So he wants immunity, full immunity. And I don't always agree with this, most times I don't, but I understand they want information and this person has it. But full immunity? Well, they're that desperate, and it seems he's the only one with answers. Bruce isn't talking, so they grant Jesse full immunity for the rest of his story, and the rest of his story is insane. Jesse says, though, on April 22nd, him and Bruce went to school like they usually do. They go to the same high school, but after school that afternoon, Bruce called Jesse up and he said, I did it. I killed them all." Jesse knew exactly who he was referring to. Ricky, Ruth Ann, Mindy, Heidi, and Crystal, his own family members. But then, Bruce goes on, and according to Jesse, he tells him in detail all of the gruesome acts that he carried out when he was murdering his family. Bruce got home from school, and Ruth Ann's daughters, Heidi and Mindy, were there. They had just gotten off the bus. Ricky and Ruth Ann were out with Crystal, their little 5-year-old. And this is what Jesse said Bruce did. Bruce tied up the 2 girls and dragged them outside behind the trailer. And since they're minors, I'm not going to be able to go into detail about what exactly occurred. Use your imagination with the fact that you know what he collected from Jesse in order to carry out this crime? Yes, he used that on these 2 poor innocent girls, cold and calculated and heartless. Then Bruce walked back into the trailer and stood in his bedroom at his bedroom window, looking outside, just waiting for his father to come home. The window was open, and Bruce was holding the weapon outside of the window, pointing it straight to where the parking area was. And when he saw his dad and Ruth Ann pull up with Crystal, this next part disgusts me. Ricky could see Bruce through the window, and he said, "What are you doing with a rifle?" And Bruce, according to Jesse, replied, "Hi, Dad," before shooting him twice. Ricky collapsed to the floor. Ruth Ann, realizing that this is a deadly situation, she runs inside, hoping that she can save her daughters, but she doesn't realize that they're already gone, except for Crystal. But as she runs into that trailer and she's just frantically trying to get to the phone, she gets a hold of that receiver in her hand, and she's shaking. She's trying to call 911, and Bruce, he walks out of his bedroom and into the living room, and he just tears that phone right out of the wall. He points the weapon at Ruth Ann and tells her to go outside of the trailer. At that point, she tries to run, but she couldn't outrun Bruce, and he shot her in the back of the head. I'm not going to go into detail about what happened to Crystal, but she did walk around to the back of the trailer where all the commotion was going on, and she saw everything. She saw everything that happened to her loved ones, and Bruce followed her, and he did the same thing to her. After that, I don't know how to get right back into the story, but I found this next part to be interesting. These people, they do not have much money. I don't know what it was like for you back in the day when you had a phone in your house, but this is a small trailer. Maybe they had more than one phone, but okay. Remember Bruce tore the phone out of the wall so that nobody could use it? Well, Jesse says that he knows all of this information because after everything was done, that's when he gets a call from Bruce. So what phone did he use? I'm just curious because something doesn't add up for me. But let's proceed because Jesse's story keeps going. Bruce, like I said, calls him up, tells him he did it, and then says, "I need your help. Get to the trailer." Jesse says when he gets out there and he sees the absolute carnage that Bruce caused his family, he starts to vomit everywhere because he's so disgusted by what his stepbrother did. Nevertheless, blood is not thicker than water in this case. Stepbrothers' bonds are stronger than blood, apparently, and Jesse decides he's going to help Bruce carry all 5 bodies to the back of the station wagon. They use a wheelbarrow to load the remains into the car. Then both Jesse and Bruce walked around to every location where her body had been, and they made sure that there was no bloody sand left behind. They were actually taking a shovel and scooping up anything, any fragments, any substance, any tissue, and they disposed of that as well. Then they decide, okay, we're going to take this car and we're going to drive it into the woods and we're going to set it on fire. Well, Jesse's not having it. He's not going anywhere near those remains. According to him, he's like, "Not me, that's all you." Instead, he says he drives the Hyundai and follows Bruce. They go those 3 miles to that area where the car was found. That's when they take the license plates off. They take those with them, they get a can of gasoline, and they dump it all over the station wagon. And Jesse says he watched as Bruce lit a match, took a piece of paper, lit that piece of paper on fire, and threw that piece of paper into that vehicle, and stood there watching it burn. And when it's done and the fire is out, he drives his little stepbrother to a pond where Bruce throws the rifle inside. Jesse says that the 2 of them were absolutely speechless, that they did not utter one word to one another. They were like zombies. I don't know if they could even comprehend what they had done at that moment, but neither one spoke to one another, according to Jesse, until the next day when they do end up talking again. It was the following morning when they saw each other at school. This is also one of the most sickening things that I read about in the story. But Jesse says he tells Bruce that he could not sleep that night, and Bruce responds, "Oh, I slept like a baby because there was no one at the house making any noise." And then he tells investigators that he's not sure what day it was, but several days later they decided to go back where the vehicle is to make sure that everything is totally burned. That's when they realize there are some very large bone fragments that are left behind, so they decided to gather up all the big pieces, their bones and skeleton, and they put them in a duffel bag that they brought with them. Jesse also lets them know that he finds what he thinks is a child's skull, and that he picks it up out of the vehicle and throws it into the duffel bag as well. They bring all the stuff to Jesse's dad's house on the farm, and they go out to the back of the barn where there's a cornfield, and they bury the license plates, and they bury the blue duffel bag with the rest of the skeletal remains inside. When the investigators first heard that Jesse wanted to talk to him, they thought that he was going to, minimize his involvement in the crime. I personally still think he is, and you just wait. They thought he was going to say, "Oh yeah, I gave him the bullets, and I don't know much else." But it turns out everything that he said matched the evidence that had been collected. So in their mind, this story was true, but we're not at trial. This is not an entire examination or a comparison of the evidence in its entirety. We're not talking statements side by side with the evidence, but this is all they know, and they're taking it as truth. I still had a lot of questions, but they did obtain a search warrant to search the property at Ron Anderson's, Jesse's father's house, and during the search they stumbled upon a notebook in Bruce's bedroom. Remember, Bruce spent half the time living there inside this diary, if you will. Bruce vented all of his anger in there regarding his father and Ruth Ann, and it even contained several entries with threats on Ricky's life. At this point, this is enough for investigators to issue a probable cause arrest warrant for Bruce Bernizer for the murder of his family. It was May 18th, 1991, and Bruce was arrested. He showed no emotions. This is him right here. However, after they started to connect more and more of the dots, it turns out that Bruce was very apprehensive every single time Jesse was being interviewed because he expressed a fear that he thought that Jesse was going to blame the murders on him. After the arrest, Jesse Anderson and the prosecution reached their plea agreement that he would testify on behalf of the state. All that he had to do now was lead police to the rifle, the duffel bag, and the license plates, and he does just that. There's no doubt that this rifle belonged to Bruce because it had the initials BB engraved on the side of it. Those are obviously Bruce's initials. However, can I just point something out? Anyone can use this weapon. It doesn't matter whose initials are on it, I'm just saying. But additionally, one of the bullets found outside the trailer did match the weapon. When they do walk around the trailer, investigators found evidence in the grass and on the sand. There were fragments of skull and bleach. After they did some DNA testing, this was proven to be the skull fragments of Crystal. After committing this crime, Bruce poured bleach on the ground and in the duffel bag, thinking that this would somehow take away the evidence. There was other information that started to come out in those notebooks from Bruce himself, like the fact that Jesse told Bruce to take care of his family outside the trailer so he wouldn't make a mess inside. When confronted about this, Jesse said, "Yeah, I just told him what I would do if that were my situation." Now, Ruth Ann's mom, Mary, she comes forward and she told the media that her daughter Ruth Ann had told her that she and the girls would be moving in with her if Ricky did not order his son to move out. So there's definitely tension in that home. She also said she thought Jesse was way more involved, and she is pissed because she doesn't think it's okay that Jesse is granted full immunity. She said that this was letting him off too easily, that he was a participant in this massacre and everything except for the actual shooting. But he helped Bruce plan how to commit the murders, even to the point of advising him to shoot them outside, right? Obviously, yes. Further, providing him with ammunition, loading the bodies, bringing them out to the location, getting rid of all the evidence, basically covering up this entire crime. She believed prosecutors could have convinced Jesse to turn on Bruce without such a lenient deal. Having to see a man who helped set the bodies of 3 young girls on fire walking the streets was just unbelievable, according to Ruth Ann's family. Mary knew more about Jesse than the police did. Her daughter had told her that Bruce would do whatever Jesse wanted. Bruce was a follower, not a leader. Those were her words. She said that Ruth Ann used to tell her Bruce would always go along with Jesse. Jesse was like an idol to Bruce. Bruce was a kind of loner, and he found some kind of deep friendship with Jesse. Well, the Polk County District Attorney Mark Biller, he defended the full immunity grant. He said, this was the only way. It was the break that we needed. I don't know, maybe better police work could have worked. Maybe better interrogation skills with Bruce. I don't know. The judge ruled, and there's more to this, that Bruce would be tried as an adult while his attorneys did not like that at all. They thought it was unfair. But the district attorney made it clear that this was something that they did not decide lightly, based on the public interest and just how heinous this crime was. Prosecutors charged Bruce with 5 counts of first-degree murder, and Alice is still there for her son, as the judge had dismissed everyone. Alice ran up and hugged and kissed Bruce, just as the bailiffs were leading him out of the courtroom. The court decided to uphold the ruling that Bruce would be charged as an adult in adult court. He's an adult because he did an adult crime, and that the trial would be sometime at the end of 1992. I'd like to mention other little arguments. The district attorney argued that Bruce should move from a juvenile facility where he was being held to a county prison. They wanted him to put his big boy pants on because there was also less of a chance that Bruce would flee from a prison. That was the argument at the time, and he remained there. The judge ruled that he was to remain there, and his bail was set at $500,000. On the 2nd anniversary of the crimes, Ricky's brother Wayne reflected and said that he thinks about Ricky all the time. And although he wants to move forward, he can't help but wonder why this had to happen. And according to him, Ricky had a really hard time ending his first marriage and he vowed to never marry again. However, when he met Ruth Ann, they just belonged together. Both families were upset. They were upset that this murder trial had been postponed for 2 years, and the judge did apologize for all the delays, and they were justified because it was necessary to determine whether Bruce would be tried as a juvenile or as an adult. But then Bruce's current defense attorney requested to be dismissed from the case, and on top of that, the prosecutor's mother passed away. So I guess it's understandable that it was postponed. So now Bruce's trial was set to start in the summer of 1993, but in April of that year he reached a plea agreement. It was 2 years to the day of the crime. Bruce pleaded guilty to the murder of Ricky and Ruth Ann, but guilty by reason of insanity for the girls. The judge handed down 2 consecutive life terms. Whether Bruce was going to spend the rest of his life in a mental institution or prison was up to this judge. And basically, Bruce's argument was that he felt it was more humane to end the girls' lives because of what he was going to do or what he had done to their parents. The reason in Bruce's mind, or what he relayed, was that this was self-preservation. That's what his attorney was arguing, that these killings were motivated by his past, what his father had done to him physically and emotionally, and that he could no longer be treated this way. According to his defense attorneys, it was the culmination of a lifetime of mistreatment, that he was forced to live in a place with no electricity, no plumbing, no running water, and that he was threatened and manipulated by his dad, that Ricky would hit walls and bully his family into submission or threaten them to get them not to leave, and that this happened at least once a week. Bruce said he would also promise gifts or say that he was going to take his own life to manipulate him, and this included his dad suspending himself from a tree or putting antlers on his head and running into the woods during deer hunting season. Again, according to Bruce, He became a scapegoat for his family's problems, that he endured this regular emotional trauma, and said that Ruth Ann wouldn't even talk to him. She would just stare at him with loathing. That his father's favorite object to use on him was a broom handle. What do you think of all this? When Ruth Ann's mom heard about this and the way that Bruce was accusing Ruth Ann of looking at him, she wanted to remind everyone that her daughter was blind in one eye. If she was looking at you in a weird way, it's because she probably had trouble seeing you. She couldn't focus correctly. It's not because she's trying to give you a dirty look, as if that's even something to justify what Bruce did. Any of this? The judge had ruled that when Bruce murdered Mindy, Heidi, and Crystal, he declared him legally insane. He was sent to a mental health institution in Madison, Wisconsin. But here are some other interesting facts before I close with something else I found out about Bruce that is more recent. In 1995, a reporter from the Wisconsin State Journal saw Bruce. This reporter was out at a movie theater, and so was Bruce. He was being escorted by someone from this mental institution, and there was a public outcry. But the psychiatrists at the hospital, they defended their actions, and they claimed that these outings were essential for the patient's recovery. According to the doctors, when you lock someone in a room, it's not how you treat mental illness. And for years, Bruce went on these outings. In the year 2000, Bruce made the news again, and this time as an alleged victim. That's right, a 35-year-old registered nurse in Casa Gagne was transferred to Bruce's unit in the mental institution, and the two of them began a very inappropriate sexual relationship in 1998, and she was charged with 2 counts of sexual misconduct, and the judge ordered her to serve 60 days of house arrest. It was wrong, but her defense claimed she was in love with Bruce. She would send him very naughty photographs and letters expressing her desires to be with him, and she also made videos. No matter where she was working in the hospital, she always found a way to get in contact with Bruce. And during one of her 8-hour shifts, she spent 6 of those hours with him. They were doing it everywhere. They were doing it in the medication room, in the leisure rooms, in the psychiatric. At one time, when he went on a picnic outing, she gave him vodka. This woman definitely had her medical license revoked. In 2013, Bruce was transferred from the mental institution to a state prison. But 4 years later, the court overturned this decision, and Bruce returned to the mental hospital, where he remains today. Now look at this gem that I found. It is basically a prison dating site. I mean, it's not. It's actually a prison pen pal site. Don't get it wrong. But look at this. Look at this little picture of Bruce. It looks like he's wearing a silk nightgown. On the side of the website, there are tabs. They say Meet Bruce, More About Bruce, Contact Information, Sentence Information. Yeah, they're going to put that last because they want you to read what Bruce has to say first. So let's read it. At the point I'm writing this, he's 47 years old. Okay, it also says that his profile will end on July 23rd, 2023. I wonder why. Well, before I get into that, let's meet Bruce. Here's what he has to say. I'm going to put some music under it so you know it's him still talking, and when I'm done, it'll stop. First of all, I don't want your money. I do need your compassion, companionship, and caring. Love is love, and my heart doesn't discriminate. I'm interested in any age, race, religion, etc. I'm a deep-feeling and sensitive man. Unfortunately, being locked up forces me to suppress those feelings. It is far too often that I must deny myself the feelings that grant me access to my greatest humanity. Despite the barriers to a normal relationship, I want and need someone in my life with whom it is safe to experience and share the depth of my emotions. I'm no fool. I know someone with a life sentence and no guarantee of parole isn't a desirable companion, but I can hope. I've spent the past 30 years trying to make amends for what I've done. Equal parts guilt and joy drive me to do whatever I can to alleviate the suffering of others, or preferably prevent it altogether. Unfortunately, the joy is ephemeral, and the guilt anchors me to actions that I can never make up for. I'm an intelligent man, always looking for ways to stimulate my mind. I'm always on to the next thing once a challenge or the moment is conquered. However, this doesn't apply to people. I make few friends, but those friendships are deep and abiding. You would honor me by responding to my profile. I look forward to building either a platonic friendship or an inmate romantic relationship, whatever suits us best." End quote. Wow, he's suppressing his emotions and feelings. I think there's another word for that I'm not going to get into. But yes, I'm sure there are certain things he can't express when he's locked up. Okay, so they give you his contact information, which I'm not going to provide up on the screen, because you can do that if you're really interested in writing him. That's not why I'm telling you all this information. I just thought that this was interesting. Bruce will be eligible for parole in 2023. Yes, this monster may be walking the streets again. What are your thoughts? Tell all. I just think about those little girls in their last moments, and there's really nothing that I want to say out loud, but the thoughts in my head haunt me.